We have a website called beyondinhabitation.org, which is the site of our lab, where we post all the seminars that we do, and we also post this, we will post the video of this conference. Now, without further ado, again, I am going to leave the floor to Francesca. Francesca is the reason, so it's your fault, that I became an academic. I come from a background in which really, you know, this wasn't the prime option. And at one point I went to Francesca and I said to her, I want to become a journalist. And she said to me, you are crazy. I mean, journalist? You want to become a journalist? And she said, you should do a PhD. And I didn't know what a PhD was. And that, sorry. I'm just stressed.
It's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning. Exactly. So
it's my fault.
Margherita really knows me. So eventually, you know, Francesca said, you should do a PhD, you should do it outside of Italy. That was nice advice, I think. But she did something very important. She gave me the material means to do the PhD. So she supported me by giving me research opportunities. And I think this is very important. It's not just the support that you gave me psychologically and emotionally, but also materially. So I'm very thankful to her, and also thankful to the other colleagues that at the time were involved in that project that allowed me to start my career. So that's why I invited Francesca here today. But the reason why I invited her is also because I took a lot from her intellectually. And I think this is maybe a way for us to get to know each other a little bit better. Francesca has a number of projects in the department, and hopefully we will hear about some of these right now, or maybe after in the conversation. So Francesca, the floor is yours, and then we will get to the rest.
Okay. Thank you, Michele. Thank you for your word, and thank you for the invitation. It's really nice to be here with all of you to introduce this seminar. I am an urban geographer. I work at the Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning at the Polytechnic and University of Torino. I am the coordinator of the research commission of this department. Or at least I used to be, because now we are in an election period and things will change, as will change my role as well. But other than that, I think, and I really hope, as Michele said, that my role as a coordinator of the research commission is only one of the reasons why Michele asked me to introduce this seminar. I think that the reasons are various. So I would like to introduce this seminar today considering 3 points that refer to 3 different stances. The first point is what I was saying, the institutional one. As coordinator of the research commission of the department, my role here today is to discuss how the research activities presented today, and more generally the ERC led by Michele, are related to the research activities of the DIST. Second point, more disciplinary. I am a geographer like Michele, and although neither he or me are particularly fascinated by disciplinary labels and boxes, I believe we both share a specific ethos of our work related to the meaning of geography as a way of seeing and feeling, as a point of view on the world, and as a way to be part of the world, as a form of knowledge, critical and or radical, however defined. Finally, the third point is the more personal, is the personal relationship between Michele and me, a long-standing relation indeed. He grew up as a scholar while I got older. I have to say that this is the very reason why to introduce this seminar today is for me especially nice and especially exciting. So I'll try to say a few things about these three aspects by using an institutional, a disciplinary, and a personal perspective, since I feel each of them helped me to highlight something different. Let's start with the institutional perspective, the more easy. At this regard, I would like to briefly introduce the Department of Regional and Urban Studies and Planning. That is an inter-university department that brings together professors and researchers from the Politecnico and the University of Torino. Both me and Michele are part of the Politecnico. I emphasize this because being part of a technical academic institution like the Politecnico is anything but neutral. I'll come back to that point in a few moments. So the department brings together various research activities organized around three broad topics: urbanization processes, cultural heritage, climate change, focusing on urban issues, urban regional governance, spatial planning, urban changes, from a social, economic, political, technological, and environmental perspective. Most of the research activities carried out in this department, I have to say that they are mainstream, often policy oriented, that is more problem solving than problem setting, just to use two formulas. It's a department that seeks to internationalize, so that hosting the ERC Inhabiting Radical Housing is really important, especially because it's the first ERC hosted by the DIST, and because only two ERC led by geographers are based in Italian university. In addition, Michele is here with a large group of researchers coming from various countries with various experiences and backgrounds. So the presence of an international and young group of researchers is a sort of fresh air for this department, especially for the Italian younger scholar. Is a big chance of learning and exchange. So first of all, thank you, Michele, and all the crew to have chosen to be part of the DIST. Moreover, I know there were in the past some bureaucratic problems, and I really know how working in the Italian academic system can be frustrating. I don't want to dismiss all these problems and issues, but since today is the first public discussion of your research, I finally want to welcome all of you here in Torino and at the DIST. So by ending my institutional role, I move to the second point, that is the disciplinary one. In this respect, I would like to reflect a little bit on the ethos of the research and the capability to adopt somehow define a critical and radical stance in urban research, especially now, and especially from here, being in Italy as part of a technical university where the technocratic approach is absolutely prevailing and where searching for certainties, solutions, and technical answer is what is really at stake and what is really important, while doubts, questions, or refusing to take things for granted are more and more considered as a wishful thinking, if not worse, to be dismissed. Well, for me, and I'm sure for all of us, they are just the reason and the meaning of doing research. This depressive figure is probably not only Italian, not only from Turin, as I guess that probably a lot of us from a lot of different places struggle with the historical and political period in which we live, and in which a continuous attempt to delegitimize and depotentialize every critical and radical thinking is so present and powerful. But at the same time, I think we have a responsibility, the responsibility to clearly show the value of critical thinking more clearly than ever. I think it's not enough to say I'm a critical or I'm a radical scholar as such, but we must assume the burden of proof of our criticality and our radicality. I think the research of Michele shows us a possible way to do that in two different but strictly intertwined ways. The first one is by looking at the minor. Michele always recalls syndicates and her minor theory, a theory that makes conscious use of data realization and displacement, enters into the cracks and works inside out, unfolding the fugitive moves and emergent practices interstitial with major production of knowledge to open the many spaces of betweenness from which to imagine, act, and live things differently. The second way is by looking at the future. In the period in which we live, in which the future seems to be more and more close, I think that showing the possibility to go on in our stubborn attempt to imagine, act, and live things differently, starting from the everyday and from one of the basic needs as dwelling and inhabiting, can show us how we can be part of something that is not only individual but collective, something that is not minor, that is minor but not dismissing, something that intervenes with sensitivity, attention, and care in the urban, searching for ways and intersection through which opposition take form in everyday life as a sort of access point to politicize the future. Finally, last point and last answer, that is the most personal one, the hardest to say without falling into nostalgia and pathetic. I will try. The first time I met Michele, I was a more or less a young professor teaching urban geography at the University of Torino. I was probably one of the first one using international scholars and debate to introduce the issues of the course, not Italian geographical debate, at that time particularly close and boring, but Anglo-American scholars as Ashamin, Nigel Thrift, Soja, Doreen Massey, and so on and so forth. Michele was one of the brilliant students I ever had. When I asked the students to read 1 or 2 articles, he read 10 articles. He always asked me something, even a hard question to answer. I probably answered the majority of time with my normal, I really don't know, but a real this and that. Michele did his master thesis with me, and then I pushed him to do his PhD in Durham with Ashamin. This was my choice and my suggestion to him. He did not understand me. He didn't understand my choice and my suggestion at that moment. But for me, it was and continues to be the choice and the suggestion I can give to a young scholar. Go around, exploring, learning differently, reading, studying, open your mind and your eyes. Michele became a brilliant scholar, as all of us know, and then he finally won his ERC and come back to Torino. I hope others will follow your path, Michele, since circulation and exchange are probably the best way to define and practice a more global and more critical geographical imagination. So thank you, Michele, to come back to Torino. And sorry, Michele, for not being able to welcome you in Torino in a better way.
There is no better way. Thank you. Okay, it's done. Get out. Thank you, Francesca, for this. It was very moving for me and very important. Thank you. Okay, so now we can move to the conference part in which I am going to share with you some of the ideas that are behind the project. So I'm going to do this through a short presentation, about 15 minutes, and then we will move to some of the researchers that are part of this big project. Let me start by telling you something. Let me start by making the PowerPoint, turning the PowerPoint big. Yeah, let's start with some context. I want to tell you, where does the idea of the project come from? And so most of my research before this project was around notions and issues of homelessness and houselessness. Most of the research that I have done took place in Italy, and then for quite a few years in Bucharest. But then I started to think, when I was at the University of Sheffield, about how to scale up my interest in issues of housing injustice and an issue of housing struggles for more just housing outside of my two contexts, Italy, especially Turin, and Bucharest in Romania. And you know, it's quite easy to scale things up, because actually housing is probably the key pressing issue of our global urban times. So I didn't have to scale anything up. I mean, the situation globally of housing is very daring and precarious. Now, when I say housing means different things in different contexts for different people. But even just by looking at some stats, we'll see that, and I never use statistics, so you know, this is about it. We see it's in front of us that housing is a contested terrain for many people around the world, because of complex histories, because of the ways in which housing is an asset for private markets, and so on and so forth. Ciao. I got both my master's degree supervisors in front of me. That's no pressure. All right, so housing is a big mess. This is a starting point, and we all agree with that. Now, there is a problem, though. The fact that housing has become one of the key issues of our time does not mean that this is normal. I mean, the new normal of housing means simply that we are in a constant crisis. And this crisis is constant because capitalism works by constantly breaking apart. The reason why global capitalism can access new markets, open new markets, and make people and dispossess essentially is because it constantly breaks apart. And by breaking apart, it constantly renews itself. So there is an interest here around the ways in which housing becomes an asset through which new capitalist formations can take place. And obviously, this is something that is very well known. We don't need an academic from Italy to tell us these kind of things. There are a number of groups that have been organizing precisely to challenge the violence of capitalist extraction through housing throughout the world for many, many years. We have a number of networks, very powerful networks, that are working from the grassroots outside of institutions in order to fight for better housing conditions, in order to fight for housing justice across the globe. We have a number of situated interventions in this way. So housing as an issue on the one hand, but also housing as a platform for organizing in the other. And here I'm still within the context, okay? This has been, obviously, it has attracted attention from academia since a long time. So again, you know, this intersection between understanding housing as this platform through which capitalism is able to reproduce itself, and at the same time understanding housing as this nexus through which communities are organizing in order to fight this form of injustice, has been central to the work of many academics in disciplines such as geography, sociology, and anthropology for many years. So when I was thinking about this project, when I was thinking in Sheffield about these kind of issues, I started to realize that what really interests me, and this is not dismissive of the work of others, actually it builds on that work, but what really concerns me as a geographer / ethnographer is in trying to get closer to housing itself, to the materiality of the thing, to the ways in which housing within its wall becomes a place of inhabitation that intersects by default a number of key injustices of our time. In a sense, housing is that infrastructure that cuts through a number of key concerns that individuals across the globe have to face in their everyday life. Now, some of these concerns obviously are related to shelter. Either you have it or you don't have it. Either you have it in a secure way or it becomes precarious. But some of these concerns are at other levels that maybe have been looked at a little bit less, especially in housing and urban scholarship. So obviously there are concerns related to patriarchal forms of inhabitation, gender struggles, struggle related to sexuality and identity that happen through and within the household, issues related to wider ecologies. How do we build our houses? Where does the sand, in order to make the cement, come from? So my idea was to start to look at the notion of housing justice through this intersectional lens. And the intersection for me at the time was this idea of asking the question, how does housing become political at a number of key intersections? So not housing as political per se, in a sense, not taking the political of housing for granted, but in trying to understand how housing become, and this notion of becoming is central in my theorizing, how housing become a space of contestation throughout several intersections in everyday life. This is a concern that I started to develop with my colleague Abdulmalik Simoni in Sheffield. And then, in a sense, it is heavily infused by anarchist thinking around housing, in particular, anarchist thinking arising from the Anglophone context. The key intersection, the key point here is about asking not really what housing is, but what housing does for people. And the does here is not just functional, it's a co-constitution of a terrain of possibilities and struggle. What housing does for people, how people can articulate wider struggles beyond sheltering through the fact that housing is constantly and always intersectional. What is the performance of housing? Now, the key problem here, and here we are getting to the project, is that if you accept a given definition of the political, or what becomes political, then in a sense you are not seeing many different ways through which housing intersectionally becomes a space of contestation. Because housing, in particular in the West, has become a political element. But the language of the political, especially the language of the westernized grassroots approach to the political, can let you see some particular intersection of housing as a terrain of contestation and may not let you see others. And here we arrive to the project. Why the project is called Inhabiting the Radicality of Housing, Inhabiting Radical Housing, is because of what I have just said. Housing in itself is a terrain of contestation. I'm not interested in providing a super theory, super everything about what that terrain of contestation is. I am interested in understanding how different people in different geographies with different histories are inhabiting that terrain of contestation. So in a sense, for me, the question is not about the end point of the political, but is about the co-constitution of a geography, of a relational geography, through which the political arise within housing, through housing. So the main aim of the project, Inhabiting Radical Housing, that's why the inhabiting part is there, is to investigate the ways in which housing struggles enable people to articulate wider fights against class, race, gender inequalities, but actually wider structural injustices of our time across geographies. If you want, the main question can be unpacked in this project by saying, how does the global fight for just housing, because a global fight is happening, how does that fight intersect with and potentially assume specific use value for daily struggles against historic and contemporary forms of dispossession? Bottom line, people, communities, groups that are fighting for housing justice, in doing so, are intersecting struggles that are deeper than the reduction of housing to sheltering or to housing as a policy concern. More often than not, they are struggling against forms of racialized dispossession. They're struggling against forms of patriarchy. They're struggling against ecological extractions through the prism of housing. This is the key of the project. Now, importantly, the idea here is not to provide a theory, a general theory about how people do this across geographies. This is not the goal. The goal is to investigate a number of instances of how housing, how the struggle for housing intersects more profound injustices across different terrains, without reducing the complexity of these very different histories to one formula. I keep on banging on this point because it's an important point for me. Now, methodologically, the project is divided across 5 different work packages. And what we aim to do with this, and especially with work package 2, 3, and 4, is to try to hold together the complexity of what I have just told you in the past 5 minutes. So clearly, the struggle for housing is already happening across places. It's a translocal, it can take translocal forms. So an entire work package is dedicated to this. And then there is another work package, the third one, which is dedicated at situated histories and experiences. And there is a fourth one, which is dedicated to the idea of connecting with other forms of knowledge in order to understand the intersectional value of housing struggles. Now, talking about work packages is actually quite boring. So what I have decided to do today, to give it a little bit of a twist, it's about speaking about analytics, because actually what we are doing here on the basis of that methodology is about deploying 3 analytical lenses through which we are doing the work that we are doing collectively. There is a strong question about the epistemologies of housing and homing. And this is my own interest. I arrive at the project, I arrive at my scholarship with the intent to ask the question of housing, to pose the question of housing and its intersection in a different way. Not disregarding what has been done before, but trying to ask different questions. Because I think that many of the problems that we have around housing are precisely related to the ways in which the question of housing is asked. If housing becomes a political fix, a policy fix, then an entire universe of the complexities I have been just said are completely vanished. The political fix, the policy fix must not be disregarded, but it cannot subsume all the complexity of housing. And this is the first concern, which is really at the core of the thing I am trying to do in the project. There is a second concern, which is very much related to the question of epistemologies. And it's about the practices through which several communities, organizers across the world are inhabiting this space of the radicality of housing. The question here could be, what are the multiple meanings of the housing political, seeing both in translocal organizing and in situated relational practice? And I think the vast majority of my researchers are working within this paradigm. And we will hear today about the kind of practices they have been engaging with. And then there is a final point, a third analytic, which I keep it as an analytic because it's not simply representational work, but it's actually work of studying, which is the collective study part. I will say something about this in a second. Let me spend another few minutes by telling you a little bit more around these analytics as an introduction to what comes next today. Now, when it comes to question of epistemologies, the key question for me is how we can reapproach question of housing beyond policy, centered in these questions, centered in them as questions of home and inhabitation. Is try to reread the question of housing to the question of homing. This started as a program of work with Abdul Malik on notions of dwelling, and especially dwelling in liminalities, which goes back to what Francesca said before on the minor. And it culminated in the first big output of the project, which is going to be published in November by Duke University Press. And it's a book called For a Liberatory Politics of Home. I've actually been working on this book for 10 years, but the project is the moment in which I had the time to actually develop the book fully. So in this book, I'm essentially tackling the apparent binary reading between home and homelessness. These two things are usually read as two completely different things. In the book, I'm trying to make a point around the ways in which the violence of homelessness is well within home. So home cannot be the solution to that violence because it actually is the machine that reproduces homelessness. And I will continue this work in the next couple of years with a second book project that centers more around the notion of how we can think beyond inhabitation, which is a provocation, obviously. We need to inhabit planet Earth, but how can we think beyond current ways of inhabiting this planet? So probably bringing in more of the ecological lens. This sits at the level of epistemologies. At the level of practices, and this is, of course, just an analytical division because all the researchers are working on epistemologies as well. At the level of practices, we have a number of different interventions. So we have two of the researchers, and we will hear from them very soon, Anna Vilenica and Veda Popovici, that are working on the second work package and are working around translocal forms of organizing, but they will say more around this in a second. And then there are a number of researchers, Mara Ferreri, Rodrigo Castriota, Devra Waldman, Chiara Cacciotti, Daniela Morpurgo, and also Chiara Cacciotti, that are working around situated forms of struggles around housing and always at the intersection with something else. Intersection with new ways of thinking policy, in the case of Mara, intersection with popular economies and work, in the case of Rodrigo, intersections with planning, in the case of Devra, eviction, in the case of Chiara Cacciotti, sex work, in the case of Daniela, and then financialization in the case of Chiara. It's about asking the same question around housing, but always through different standpoints. The idea is that they write their own piece, of course, but we also try to do some collaborative work on this together in order to try to bring together some of the threads of the project. And then the final strand is around collective study. You all know, I guess, and if you don't, this is a way of introducing it to you, that on top of the project, we also have a lab, which is called Beyond Inhabitation Lab. Now, the lab is not just to represent what the project does. In fact, we don't use the lab for that. We don't really use it for that reason. What we try to do in the lab is to work with a number of scholars that are asking questions of inhabitation, but are not directly working on housing. Some of them are. Two of them, for instance, are here today, my good friend Margherita Grazioli and Erin McElroy, and they do work with housing, but some others here do not. So it's about mixing things up and having this idea of collective study. Within the lab, we also have a number of touring colleagues, and we also have fellows that have come as part of this project, as part of this lab with their own fellowships. So we have Melissa Garcia-Lamarca, who is also online with Marie Curie, and we have Jennifer Zahan working with an Urban Studies Foundation fellow. And back in the room, we have Daniela, who will join us with Marie Curie from September. So the lab is not a container for the project. It's a way of engaging in a number of collective reflection. So this is my introduction. I wanted to let you perceive that we are working across, of course, a number of different geographies, but with 3 different analytics. There is one related to the epistemologies of housing and homing, which is very close to my heart. There is one related to practices, intersections of housing struggles. And then there is one related to collective study. I will say something later on how I believe we can hold these things together. But now I will let my researchers, the researchers working with me, because they are not mine really, to speak for themselves. Now, how we're going to do this? We are going to hear from Mara, Anna, and Veda in a row. After each presentation, we may have time for one question, but the debate is going to happen at the end, okay? After them, after Veda, we are going to take a break. We're going to take 20 minutes break, enjoy some coffee, relax a little bit, ventilate the room. Then we come back and we're going to have 4 more researchers. Oluwafemi is not with us today. Oluwafemi moved on to a permanent job in New Zealand. So I'm very happy for him. So he won't present, but we will have Rodrigo, Devra, Chiara, and Daniela. I will wrap up, and then we will move to the discussion with 2 of our colleagues from this, Nadia Caruso and Francesco Chiodelli, and with some external guests. I've already said about Erin and Margherita. We are also joined by my very good friend, Ryan Powell from the University of Sheffield, but they provide some very kind provocations. So let's start with Mara, and then we will have time for questions and conversations at the end. So yeah, I put your face up there, Mara, just for the sake of it. So yeah. So Mara is going to present like everybody else for around 12 minutes, and then we move on. Yeah.
So thank you, Michele. Thank you, Francesca, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm very honored to be the first one to speak. So, and I hope that some of the threads that Michele was weaving into in the introductory presentation will resonate in the presentation I'm giving now. So I'm Mara Ferreri. I'm a geographer, an urban and housing geographer. I've recently joined the project last autumn after working in the UK and in Spain. And my contribution to this project could be titled preliminarily, Differential Housing Commoning in Europe. I'm kind of working mostly in Southern Europe at the moment, having worked in Northern Europe previously. So,
speak up and I will try to organize the mic.
Okay, I will project. So my contribution sits within the work package 3, Radical Practices. This draws on ongoing research and long-term engagement in critical geographical approaches to urban and housing precarity. I could
try to use this. Sorry.
Okay.
Is it any better? Probably not.
Is this any better?
Try again.
Okay. All right. So, okay. Maybe like this. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay, then I'll hold it up. So as I was saying, my contribution sits within work package 3, Radical Practices. This contribution builds on housing commoning against precarization, which is a line of reasoning, a line of research that I've been developing over a period of several years. in the UK, in London, and in Spain, in Barcelona. Some of this research has kind of morphed more and more towards questions around housing and housing common, including some of the research that I undertook as a Marie Curie postdoctoral research fellow at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And very much my approach is thinking about housing commons as defined by decommodification and self-governance, but also thinking about in a processual sense. So always thinking about commons as commoning, as practices that produce housing and reproduce housing as a potential common. And in this sense, I'm interested in prefigurative practices. I'm interested in the ways in which they reframe home at multiple intersections of difference, but I'm also interested in going beyond prefiguration. And so what I will do in the course of the next 2 years as part of this project is really to try and think about what are the differential infrastructures that are emerging for decommodification and for self-governance around housing and how they intersect with policy. My preliminary research questions here are very much thinking about the relationship between housing movement and infrastructures for decommodification and prefiguration, and how these are responding to deep-rooted multiple pressures and mechanisms of dispossession. And here, when I think about dispossession, I'm not just talking about material dispossession, but also epistemic dispossession. And so in my interest, I'm looking at tenure precarity, but I'm also looking at patriarchy, at racism, and neocoloniality. And in this sense, I'm interested in how these practices and the infrastructure that enable them reimagine and reformulate inhabitation and social spatial relations across gender, race, family and kinship ties, credit and debt, ownership. And finally, taking a more ethnographic approach, I'm interested in understanding more about the intimate political geographies of such radical reformulation through and beyond what we might generally understand as resistance, but also what we might understand as policymaking and policy. And my approach in this, I suppose, is one of open methodological frameworks, open to the encounters with movements that I'm engaged with, that I will be engaged with, in what some scholars coming from an action research trajectory would call movement-relevant research. And just to give you a bit of a sense of what I'm talking about here, one of the situations or one of the, let's say, the movements that I've been engaged with for several years is in Catalonia, is the movement for housing cooperativism of a new kind, en gestió d'ús in Catalan, meaning basically a zero equity lease-based form of cooperativism. In 2015, so you may remember, just above the peak of the mortgage repossession crisis in Spain, there was only one case of actual inhabitation with this model, and 2 that were under construction, one as a new build and one as a refurbished property. Fast forward to 2021, there are over 30 projects all across the region, many of them in Barcelona, around half. So we're talking about around 500 dwelling units. I know that's very marginal. However, each of these projects presents something which is quite specific and has some incredibly deep-rooted engagement with local organizing and also with local needs and forms of resistance to dispossession. So what I'm trying to picture here is a little bit, in a sense, the wider context, as well as introducing one of the actors, which is a research partner, Latina Foundation. It's a foundation I've been engaged with for several years. That sort of emerges from housing and cooperativist movements and tries to promote zero equity cooperative housing in Catalonia and beyond. And through this collaboration, which also involves other researchers, so I'm kind of coordinating other researchers who are trying to build a knowledge base in Catalonia on these practices, which have happened quite rapidly. We have decided to work over the next year on 3 in-depth case studies. I'm going to very briefly give you some examples. But they're all mechanisms that involve a degree of housing decommodification and a degree of self-governance. The first is the reverse mortgage mechanism, or senso vitalicio, senso vitalici, in a cooperative vein. The second is community land trust. So the first examples of community land trust in Spain, but particularly some that involve movements and cooperative credit institutions, as opposed to movements or community organizations and local governments necessarily. And the third is the right to intervene and block market transactions that concern financialized residential real estate assets. This is called Anterior Retracto, and it's a new law that was introduced as part of the housing emergency Catalan legislative effort that emerged from some of these movements. And so just to give you some snippets from this reverse mortgage mechanism and the reason why I'm quite interested in it, we all know that housing inheritance is a keystone in transmission of intergenerational wealth, and also in the reproduction and exacerbation of inequalities in their specialization. But at the same time, we also know that homeownership for some groups of people, including elderly people, is really what kind of saves them in the moment of an intersecting crisis of welfare and elderly care. And so the reverse mortgage as a financial instrument already exists. There is a market for it. And it's basically what allows people who are asset rich but income poor to continue living in the properties they live in. So you're basically remortgaging your home in exchange for a sort of a lifelong income. And so what this organization is doing and what I'm researching at the moment is how this can be done in a cooperative way. And this emerges from an activist in her 80s who decided she wanted her home, her owner-occupied home, to go to the housing movement, to the cooperative movement for permanent decommodification. So what I'm trying to understand there is motivations, what are the relations that are getting undone in this context, and if we want to get inspired by Donna Haraway, thinking also about what that means in thinking about property in relation to making kin, as opposed to reproducing familistic housing regimes in Southern Europe, which is one of the key characteristics of the housing systems here. And clearly, I'm not just thinking about these models or these policies in the abstract. I'm taking an ethnographic approach to this, which has this long-term engagement. Thinking also about the infrastructures, soft, hard, legal, political, with capital P and small p, that enable this reclaiming and mobilizing, from protests to interventions, from demands to the institutions, to much more kind of grassroots organizing. And here, for example, thinking about the intersection of feminist struggles, anti-racist struggles, and housing struggles, both in Catalonia and beyond. And for example, the recent 8th of March, rather the night before the 7th of March demonstration, where for the first time, the feminist march went to a migration identification or removal center, questioning some of the privilege of the position of white Europeans, bringing sex work, bringing question of carcerality, to rethinking the feminist question also around residency requirements and evictions. And in this sense, what I can do and what is enabled me to see is the formal and informal relationship between these forms of organizing and these reflections and the cooperative housing movement on site. So this is a bit more established because it's a place where I've lived, it's a place where I've been involved for a long time. I've recently moved to Piedmont. This is quite new for me if we want to talk about fields. But I've been lucky enough to be invited again to engage in a movement-relevant production of knowledge with an organization, with several organizations that are trying, in a sense, to accompany a process of rethinking low-cost housing self-management that emerged from a refugee-led collective struggle. And so in this sense, I'm kind of accompanying them to think through the passage from this collective transitory residence, which emerged in 2014 through struggles against evictions and for self-managed dwelling, now towards a more institutional, if we want, a more long-term project. And here some of the issues that already emerged have to do with transience and the question of defining who is the political subject of these commons, beyond these ideas of intentional and stable communities, and especially how that intersects with different dynamics of migration, return migration, and kind of movement more broadly. And another question has very much to do with what is the role of these processes of institutionalization when we are thinking about the informal mutual aid, governance, care, and economies, which sustain many of these practices of dwelling. And so I've been using this concept of precarious institutionalization as a way of thinking through ways of institutionalization that are not necessarily fixed and that might be able to adapt to what Fred Moulton and others would maybe talk about in terms of undercommons. So to conclude, when I'm thinking about policies, I guess I'm inspired to take an infrastructural analytical approach. I'm trying to think about the forces at play, the values, the convergence of these in patterns of movement. And I'm also thinking about it, so I'm thinking policies very much as how they are practiced, how they are challenged, how they become contested in given territories, but also how they cross-pollinate with other examples elsewhere. I'm very much thinking about the extension of commoning through and beyond prefiguration, so going beyond small-scale examples and really thinking about what could be established more broadly. I'm thinking beyond the state and the market as the two sites where policy are located. And I'm particularly thinking about the way in which the reclaiming and mobilizing activities are part and parcel of this making of policy communities for transforming and reclaiming land, property, and also credit, which is a very understudied element in the housing commons literature. And I will end here. Thank you.
We have time for maybe a question, if anybody would like to ask any clarification at this point. Otherwise, we can also leave it for the discussion at the end. Yeah? Okay. Mara, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, fantastic. Thank you, Mara. I forgot to say that Mara is doing, she currently holds an RTDA position here in the department. Now we are moving, yes, we are moving to Dr. Anna Vilenica. Yeah. Anna, do you want to come here? Thank you very much. So Anna is working with us on the second work package, and now I will just try to find a way to make it big. Yeah.
Thank you. How do I use this?
Yeah, try.
Is this okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Hi everyone, my name is Anna Vilenica. I'm a researcher and organizer from Serbia originally, but my recent work has been about the international struggles. It is such a great pleasure to talk in front of the full room, and it's very exciting for me to present little pieces of what I have been doing recently. So the title of my presentation is Grammars of Tenant International from Elsewhere, Learning from the Struggles for Home in Abya Yala. So in this concise presentation, I will provide a preliminary summary of the insights I have acquired regarding grammars of internationalism and its practical applications through intersections and conversations with base leaders, organizers, thinkers engaged in various territories and struggles in New York City, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. Across the continent, Abya Yala is an alternative name for the American continent that predates the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Let me just this is working. So the so-called housing crisis is not an unforeseen consequence on unpredictable occurrences. Rather, it stems from deliberate acts of organized dispossession and abandonment, driven by the pursuit of capital accumulation, specifically through the utilization of gendered and racialized housing exchange value, benefiting only a few. It is crucial to recognize that housing dispossession and abandonment are not confined solely to the local level within national borders. Rather, they form a global phenomena recognized as a forced internationalism. This complex landscape involves various actors, including states, transnational corporations, and nonprofit organizations collaborating across borders to profit from our homes. The organized practices of housing dispossession and abandonment not only perpetuate historical colonial relations, but also introduce new forms of neocolonialism. As a result of multiple crises, intersecting within the housing issues such as wars, energy crisis, and debt crisis, many people have been compelled to migrate to countries which have historically contributed to the exacerbations of catastrophes in their homeland. Meanwhile, those who remain in their birthplace face undignified living conditions, having been initially dispossessed and subsequently abandoned by institutional systems. Countless individuals in the so-called Americas are currently grappling with homelessness, evictions, and deplorable living conditions. Indigenous communities, Black people, people of color, and people in migration are acutely experiencing these conditions than others. So despite and against these networks of housing dispossession and abandonment, grassroots tenant movements and people in struggles animating territories in resistance have nurtured internationalism as a horizon, as an everyday practice, and as a method of organizing. In social movement studies recently, there have been efforts to talk about resistance against multiple governance levels, including international and regional agencies such as International Monetary Fund, World Bank, Frontex, European Union, NAFTA, global civil society, and informal networks via notions such as complex internationalism. What is missing in this approach are connections between trajectories, experiences, and struggles that unfold at different places beyond standard repertoires of action registered by social movement and civil society studies. The feminist approach to internationalism has offered the framework that addresses these gaps by recognizing the significance of the space of social reproduction in our struggle. In her book, Feminist International, How to Challenge Everything, Veronica Gago explores the emergence of feminist internationalism that challenges traditional geographic and organizational boundaries. The form of organizing has its roots in Latin America and is characterized by transborder alliances, a lack of centralized structure, and a plurinational approach that recognizes the diversity within any given territory. Contemporary grammars of internationalism from elsewhere within the struggles for home in New York City, Los Angeles, and Mexico City exhibit similar characteristics as the realm of home and housing serves a crucial space for social reproduction. Tenant internationalism comprises alliances that challenge the constraints of non-state organizing at every possible point of connection, encompassing everyday internationalism, formal and informal practices of comradeship, and transnational solidarity. This form of internationalism demonstrates the strength of Black Lives Matter housing movement for home of Latin American migrant women in the United States, original peoples movement for dignified housing in Latin America, movements for autonomous housing, and movements against generalized housing precarity on both continents. This form of internationalism is territorialized and embodied in concrete struggles, forging links from their rootedness in a concrete situation. So this form of internationalism doesn't exclude other forms of more formalized internationalism, working like formalized coalition, but coexist in parallel and in occasional intersection with these struggles. It does not necessitate sacrificing specificity in the pursuit of shared agenda or program. Instead, it constructs an agenda that incorporates and addresses the uniqueness of struggles and requirements of each individual community. This approach emphasizes the importance of horizontal connections and alliances rather than hierarchical ones. The use of international in this context is an adjective that describes the encounters of different struggles rather than the state of being in particular constellation. Grammars of tenant international from elsewhere is some of their manifestations are everyday housing internationalism from the margins, internationalism as a method, and emerging international housing horizons and freedom dreams. In his work, Timothy Brennan describes internationalism as an ideology embraced by those who often lack the resources to actively engage in international forms of solidarity and networking, yet maintaining a vast interest in them. Subaltern groups, in his opinion, practice internationalism yet to come. My research has shown that there are forms of internationalism practiced by tenants in struggle that stayed invisible for Brennan due to his limited understanding of internationalism. Numerous people escaping poverty and conflict in Latin America and Africa have established international networks of housing support while on the move and upon reaching their destination in the United States and Canada. This encompasses mobile housing commons formed by loosely organized networks of individuals, as well as formal and informal organizations spanning borders and transcending housing market dynamics in their chosen places of residence. Within particular communities, there have also been discussions regarding the potential negative and exclusionary impact that such internationalist networks might have on individuals who do not belong to the specific groups, and how to open up these networks to them as well. Comradeship has emerged as a vital component in fostering internationalism among grassroots housing organizations and movements. It entails establishing connections and alliances based on the shared dedication to a common cause, and has played a pivotal role in facilitating solidarity, mutual learning, and exchange between movements across the globe. A notable illustration of this comradeship is observed through visits made by members of organizations in Los Angeles and Mexico City, can be observed to Europe. Some have explored the Red Vienna project in Austria to gain insight into social housing, while others have engaged with various movements and squads in Italy. Additionally, groups have been actively establishing solidarity networks to provide accommodation for comrades who have fallen victims to political persecution from different countries and are in dire need. Furthermore, there exist international support mechanisms aimed at assisting comrades who may be facing illness or incarceration. The emergencies of popular education practices within grassroots movements and resistant territories is characterized by an international perspective, effectively turning internationalism into an educational project. Popular education draws upon the liberal theology of Paulo Freire and Marxism, serving as a form of political education for the popular classes. Numerous groups have embraced popular education in various formats, operating at the local, regional, and international level. For instance, the Los Angeles Tenants Union has established the Escuelita, a monthly space dedicated to learning and skill sharing among community leaders and organizers from local chapters across the city. This platform enables organizers to exchange their experience and gain insights from the struggles in other chapters and communities. The Escuelita provides an opportunity to delve into the histories of tenants organizing and collaboratively envision a more just Los Angeles. Moreover, some members of the Los Angeles Tenants Union are actively involved in the Popular Education Project, which has recently launched the International People's Assembly. On the other hand, Secretaria Latinoamericana de la Vivienda y la Hábitat Popular has organized intensive internship programs comprising visits lasting from 5 to 7 days, within the purpose of learning from specific organizing experiences within the unique context of Latin America. Similar to feminist organizing, internationalism has served as a method for cultivating tenant power within popular struggles. When examining the more or less formal grassroots network, a division can be observed between organizations in so-called North America and Latin America. For example, recently formed Autonomous Tenants Union Network is an alliance primarily comprising Autonomous Tenants Union based in the United States and to a smaller extent in Canada. This network emerged as a response to the renewed momentum gained by the tenants organizing in United States during COVID around rent strike. In Latin America, the focus has mostly been on autonomous self-construction. Despite these divisions, individuals and groups have traversed borders, employing internationalism as a method to forge connections and collaboration. In the recent times, groups and networks from the United States and Mexico have been actively organizing and fundraising with the aim to travel to Venezuela. The purpose is to learn from local struggles and provide support to individuals and grounds for confining the impact of US sanctions. So on the one hand, we had the Escuelita Latinoamericana de Autogestión de Habitat organized in Venezuela by the Secretariat Latinoamericana. And on the other side, we have like, this was in April, and in June, different groups of activists like Los Angeles Tenants Union, LACLA, and TANT are organizing Poder para el Pueblo Brigade to go to Venezuela and support the people there. So I will take it to the end. So the third point that I kind of wanted to introduce is the emergence of these internationalist housing horizons and freedom dreams. So Black and Indigenous struggles, often dismissed as closed and identitarian, are now recognized as a space of borderless alliances and communal embodiment, challenging systemic violences and presenting alternative horizons for tenant struggles. The plurinational demands articulated by Indigenous people go beyond mere criticism of the existing settled colonial oppressive and exploitative housing system. They call for fundamental transformation of the very foundation of the housing system, shifting from the focus on exchange value and predatory inclusion to the creation of life-giving geographies and the colonial housing agendas. These struggles raise profound questions such as, what does housing justice mean on the stolen land? Simultaneously, the centrality of Blackness as a method has emerged, centering Black thought, Black experience, and Black perspectives within the housing system. Communities have mobilized in resistance against the oppressive practices within which Nadia calls the racial banishment. Recent discussions kept prompting critical reflections, asking questions such as, what does it entail to consider housing from the perspective of once being owned? Or how to envision housing as in abolitionist way. And I will just take half a minute of your time. So I'm deeply grateful and humbled by the opportunity to meet and collaborate with base leaders, organizers, and thinkers in New York, Los Angeles, and Mexico City. In alignment with them, some of the discussions we had will be edited and published in a conversation series, Learning from the Struggles for Home in Abya Yala in the Radical Housing Journal, an important node in Tenants International infrastructure that we have established to share knowledge about the radical housing struggle in an open source manner. As I conclude, I make a steadified commitment to pursue in my endeavors to cultivate international networks wherever possible, both within and beyond academia. I remain dedicated to transcending the prevailing tendency to shrink such spaces within universities and projects by continuously forging connections that extend beyond institutional boundaries. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I kind of exceeded the time.
Thank you, Anna. Whoops. This is
I tried.
Yeah, you are. Okay, thank you, Anna. Before taking a break, we are moving on with my comrade and friend, Veda Popovici. Now, I'm just going to open up Veda's presentation. So you also have a peek on the ways in which we use Teams. Oh, sorry, it's here. Okay. So take this. Styling updates, of course.
That's okay.
Of course, Windows is installing updates right now because this is what we needed, right? Okay. Okay, Veda, 12 minutes. Okay, I'll put it here.
Oh, right.
So you have it already? Yeah. Do you see everything from home? Do you see the PowerPoint, the presentation from Veda? They do, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Veda also is working on the second work package, so she's also working on translocal organizing. So please, Veda.
Yes, thank you, Michele. It's so happy to be here. I'm mostly in Bucharest, and so I see my colleagues and comrades here rarely. So this is a very special occasion, an important occasion. So networks of action, intersections of struggles, housing activism in a transnational European context. It could mean a lot of things, but so what I'm focusing is actually looking more closely to the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing and the city. But up until then, just a few words on some just very brief notes on literature on housing organizing. As an assemblage of discourses and practices developed by concrete social movements with explicit and intentional goals of emancipation and system critique. This is housing organizing, and research has focused on specific movements, organizations, and events, of course, generally. This produces the fact that there is limited exploration of transnational versus international dimensions within housing justice movements. So there are efforts, of course, that look on geopolitical and political historical differences between Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. However, there is still much room to explore critically the way movements address such differences within their own structures and practices. Now, we take up the intention to displace epistemologies of housing organizing that center around housing as a materialist resource. And so from a critical geographical perspective, we find that many movements, certain movements are more studies, such as the PAH and the droit au logement in France. This actually can indicate a limitation of understanding the role of geopolitical differences and dynamics, again, inside the movement, especially in terms of epistemological privilege on what is political enough, what is rebellious enough, what counts as relevant, what builds history, basically. Okay, so the networks I'm looking at, the focus is on the European Action Coalition for the Right to Housing and the City. What is really important to say about this network is that it has a consistent radical position, that is militant, anti-capitalist, and anti-racist, and it is a consensus throughout the network. Other networks will be also considered, and I'm already considering them.
such as the Recht auf Stadt in Germany, the Block for Housing in Romania, and other research-based networks or project-based networks. Now, the EAC, the European Action Coalition, was founded in 2013. It is, it truly, it has covers a lot of territory in Europe. Some info is that it has 1 to 2 plenary in-person meetings per year with delegates from all organizations. It has cross-border working groups on specific topics such as social housing, anti-eviction work. And it is dedicated to mutual support and sustainability between the groups. Now, my own position in this whole story is that I'm a housing activist since 2013, part of the Common Front for Housing Rights in Bucharest, mostly doing anti-eviction and community organizing work. I've also been involved in the National Federation, the Block for Housing in Romania, and I have been involved in the EAC since 2014. Now, reflecting on this, I see myself as an engaged researcher or activist scholar, and very importantly, the key political position that I bring in this context is a decolonial position based on experiential politics. So I'm very actually interested and I have a special attention to geopolitical dynamics of power and knowledge production and dissemination. Now, what is important is that I intend to have thorough accountability on my work, and especially in a dimension of bringing knowledge and information and circulating that information to such a degree that is relevant to the movement and empowers the movement. And of course, having a very a big priority in safety and sensitive information. Now, sources are individual interviews and collective interviews. This is kind of something that I find really important, that the interview is actually a conversation with comrades, and in which I'm trying to bring us together in a shared space of reflection on how does the network work. Now, the profiles of participants are all established, trusted comrades. So there is this relationship between us. And they are participants to a high number of coalition events. And I can say much more about the profiles, but maybe we can skip to other info. Other sources are autoethnography. So I have participated to many of the coalition's events, plenaries, projects, and so on. I am also engaging in participatory observation. And then there's also a bunch of other stuff, internal materials, minutes, reports, and other public materials. Now, getting to the more like juicy stuff. So building a collective transnational political consciousness, in the context of the EAC. So transnational practices actually assemble towards an internationalist horizon. This is kind of a consensus between activists in the coalition. Building political consciousness, however, through transnational organizing includes an appeal to a European-wide political consciousness. So what is that? And so in critically exploring this, I'm asking to what degree does this political horizon actually reproduce or oppose pose Eurocentric narratives of Europeanization as advanced by institutions, human rights ideology, and the global humanitarian and geo-industrial complex, and externalizing and outsourcing the roles of the state, given the complex history of Western welfare state and the Eastern social state, the post-communist social state. building a collective transnational political consciousness too. So there are three dimensions that speak to the beauty of the political space that the coalition creates. One is witnessing, the coalition as an arena of witnessing struggles from other contexts, finding your own kind, and then becoming a space to exercise and consolidate a subjectivity anchored in anti-capitalism and anti-racism, but that arrives there by effort and intention and from a place of privilege. This is a very interesting thing, given the fact that the movements have actually a diversity of people that come from a diversity of backgrounds in terms of class composition, education, and other types of cultures. And then radicalizing a space where the idea of understanding and organizing your life as political work is consolidating, a context to exercise comradeship. Some challenges and some empowerments, and this is a bit of a limitation in terms of this kind of like two is like pros and cons, but it's a work in progress. So this is just a little workshopping. There are two big challenges that are very immediate and very concrete. One is that struggles are built nationally. So activists organized around a national situation. They are looking at specific evictions, phenomenon. They're looking at patterns. They're looking at how policies are producing that. They're looking at the historical dimension of property distribution, which is very nationally contextualized. And then, so intentional transnational action that also builds towards internationalism means a change in the way groups organize their strategy and agenda. So actually, there must be some sort of a change, some sort of like an actual intention on how the activists redefine their and reorganize their struggle. And the diversity of languages and organizing cultures, but languages. This is something to like really not underestimate. The empowerment, I'm just gonna briefly mention something that was also mentioned by Anna, that in a way, this idea that if capital is that transnational, so should be our struggle, which is a very kind of an interesting like slogan and like political idea that actually translates as having much more of a common enemy than a common oppression. And then very interestingly, transnational institutions, EU and UN related, are seen critically across groups. And bringing this to an end, what is exploring further key moments and their role in building togetherness and shaping the transnational vision. Two ideas: the Housing Action Day. The Housing Action Day is exactly that, a Housing Action Day, and it happens in many cities, many countries, and it's truly quite diverse. It's been happening for 3 years now, and it has become something that activists are really invested in and very proud of. So the relevance of the HAD as a transfer or circulation of, interestingly, visibility and legitimation. As one comrade put it, putting out a poster on a building becomes as valuable as a 30,000 march, which obviously has the potential to subvert historical, colonial or imperialist dynamics of, what is relevant, what is political, and so on. So, and another thing is looking at this cluster of events that happened in Europe that have very much influenced housing policies and legislation, which is the pandemic moratoriums on evictions, the Berlin referendum into 2021, and the financial support of housing for war refugees. These are like three very important, relevant housing related events that have totally transformed housing policies and legislation. And obviously they are to a big degree reflected in the movement. Yeah, these are my references, and thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Veda. That was excellent. So for the people at home, we are reconvening again at 4 p.m. Central European time. So it's roughly half an hour from now. For everyone here, just enjoy the coffee and we get back at 4, okay? Thank you, everyone. Let's take a break now. Grazie di essere venuto. Again. Okay, so before we move on, I'll just take 30 seconds to say that I decided on this particular format of having one after the other, because the alternative was going to be to have a conference for the entire day, and the entire day is very long. So we're going to go one after the other, and hopefully we're also going to have informal time for conversations at the end. Okay, so now we heard in the first part, beyond myself and Francesco, of course, and by the way, just opening the brackets, the guy that was sitting in front of me at the beginning is Giuseppe De Matteis. Giuseppe De Matteis is it is a very important Newman geographer in the Italian context, but beyond Italy as well. And he has been formative for many of us here in Turin, obviously, for Francesca, with Francesca, and also for myself. And it's beautiful to see somebody that is probably 87, 88, something like that.
88 in June.
88 in June, coming into the room with curiosity. It's a very beautiful thing. I just wanted to acknowledge that for the people that don't know about Giuseppe. Okay, so in the first half, we heard about 3 of my colleagues working in the project. Mara, kicking off with this very nuanced reading of policies and collectivism. And then we heard from Anna and Veda providing a taste of the work that they are doing respectively on translocal organizing and internationalism in the Americas and in Europe. Now, in the second part, we are going to listen to 4 presentations of scholars that are working in the third work package around practices of housing struggles at the intersection with other forms of social injustice or social practice. And the first one is going to be Dr. Rodrigo Castriota. Rodrigo joined us from Belo Horizonte in Brazil, and now he's going to present about his work over there. I'm going to share the screen and leave the floor to Rodrigo. Which one do you think is the right one? This one? Just a second, I want to make sure at home you see the right thing. Chiara, sorry. Can you tell me what do you see, Chiara? Do you see the double screen or the main one? Which one? You see the presentation screen. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to figure which one is the right one to share for people at home. Just bear with me. This is one.
It's the top one.
This one?
Yeah.
The entire screen.
Let's see. Always the same? Okay, it's fine. So we start again with Rodrigo and 12 minutes like everyone else. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? No, kind of. Okay, I'm just gonna hold this. Hello, people. How are you doing? All good? Okay. Thank you all for being here in person and online. My name is Rodrigo Castriota, as the Italians pronounce it. I am from Brazil, thank goodness. And today I'm going to give you a little glimpse into this ongoing research, which is tentatively entitled The Work of Inhabitation, Housing and Popular Economies in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, which, you know, in a nutshell, interrogates home as a place of work and interrogates the broader economic performance of home, to use the term Michele just used, to understand what is at stake for urban majorities and popular economic circuits when home becomes a space of production, of exchange, of storage, and so on. So, like my colleagues here, my research aims to understand home beyond shelter. So it investigates home not only as a space of dwelling, but also as a dynamic economic unit. And that is very much the case in Brazil, where home has played a historical role in guaranteeing livelihoods of the urban majorities as a place of work. So for instance, during the pandemic, we all heard a lot about home office, as most of us were relocated into confinement. But in Brazilian cities, we know that this process is much older and wider. We know that in each neighborhood, but specifically in urban peripheries, and we know that in many homes, but especially in those homes subjected to some form of precarious housing security, we will find a craftsman, a home cook, a seamstress, who have been doing home office for many decades, and often for many generations, but never really had their work at home socially legitimized and recognized. So I think politically, this is the first thing at stake when looking at this intersection. And secondly, because this is a widespread condition amongst urban majorities, they are understood not as individual efforts, but as a constitutive part of entire economies, encapsulated in the notion of popular economies, which is a Latin American concept and a long-held intellectual tradition. These economies and practices and forms of provisioning, is very safe to say, often have home as their fundamental base. So here is about understanding what does the politics of dwelling look like when home becomes an economic unit. Now, these are some of my research questions. The first one refers to the diversity of situations that I have encountered in the field, which is much higher than I initially thought. So how diverse is home as an economic unit, and what kinds of activities take place? The second one is what are the politics of dwelling when home has an economic function, and how the urban majorities can conciliate those tensions, which refers to how you might need to negotiate the spaces in your house with your parents or siblings, or maybe how your relationship with your neighbor might change because all of the dust that is flying from your workshop to their window every day is bothering them. or maybe how the relationship with the state might change because we decided to build the second floor to your house to make the ground floor a workshop. And finally, what are the ways in which the fight for housing and the fight for work are articulated? Now, before I delve into the, presenting some results, a quick methodological note to say that I did my fieldwork in Belo Horizonte, my hometown, in the past 6 months. I just got back, so be patient. And I have conducted interviews and participant observation, taken some photographs, and using the fairs in the streets as the main gateway to explore home. And maybe a final note, just saying that this research was very exploratory, is that there's not much written about this besides some keywords like home-based enterprises and housing informality and work informality. So this was quite exploratory. And here I'm going to show you these results in the three main axes. One refers to the economic diversity of home, a second, the affective dimensions of home, and a third, the material dimensions of home. So first of all, there is a large variety of functions that home has, including production in all kinds of ways, from manufacturing to actually farming, to storage, to exchange, all kinds of services that you can imagine, and gatherings, through different kinds of activities, like craftsmanship and textile and food and cosmetics, but also like nail salons and massage therapies and classes. So home has a very diverse economic performance, let's say. And it's interesting to see not only the versatility of rooms, but also how gardens become productive for domestic consumption, but also for activities related to the business, how garages become mechanic workshops, how a home facade becomes a store, sometimes through an awning and a bench, but sometimes through more significant renovations. And also how the dog seemed to like it, but also how new rooms are also built as extensions of the house, which are put for rental. So this had a dialogue with a growing literature on informality as speculation, on like rentiership from below. And sometimes, which for me is very impressive, it all takes place at the same time so that residents can make the most out of home in this speculative and economic sense. Secondly, the negotiations. In this affective dimension, there are many generalities that we might recognize from our lives in the pandemic, like working very long hours, because when you work from home, there's also always something to do, or the trouble with accountancy, like what money refers to the business and what money refers to the domestic economy, the problem of all kinds of smells and noises and tastes that other residents of the house might have to endure, the overlapping of different forms of work, like the business in itself, but also domestic work and care work, which is of course where gender plays a major role, and also the inability to maintain production standards because you have kids and pets all over the place. But here I want to take just a couple of minutes to tell a short story about each of these photographs so you can have a more concrete sense of what I'm talking about. So the first one that you see in the upper left, a 72-year-old woman produces household linens, and besides recycled material, the textile inputs she needs are acquired through the exchange of seeds and plants that she grows in her backyard. Her sewing machines are in her bedroom, and the other materials are all scattered around the house, like the mannequin you see in the picture. Every other day, she takes care of her great-grandchild, who is scared of the mannequins, so she has to move them every 48 hours. Although with great difficulty given her age. The second picture in the middle left, a married couple produces cosmetics at home, such as soaps, balms, and lotion. This room is where they store everything related to the cosmetics business and where the husband also works with wood, like pendants and earrings for sale. They fought over the room for a very long time because that's where the wife's sister used to live. Ultimately, they had to send her away in order to avoid other kinds of fights related to not having a proper space at home, but now the disagreement lies in the cleaning procedures because the wood residues can contaminate the cosmetics. Third one, bottom left, this is a doghouse. The same couple from the previous picture had to evict their own dog to use that doghouse as infrastructure. So at home, the former doghouse stores the goods that will be sold at the fair the next day. And at the fair, it is used to display the projects for sale. And finally, the fourth one on the right, which is my personal favorite, a 52-year-old woman assembles and sells potted plants. Besides having to take care of her 82-year-old aunt that lives next door, she also has to endure constant complaining of her sister about the mess in the living room. They had years of arguments regarding the dispersion of objects, the appropriate spaces for working with the plants, and even the relationship with the neighbors, since the neighbors see one of them picking up pieces of wood in the street and assume both sisters are hoarders. After their sister's ultimatum, either the plants go or I go, they agreed on moving the activities to a minuscule laundry room, which is hard to work in, but the sister had to come to terms with having the plants she hates put in her own bed every afternoon, since it is the only place in the entire apartment where they can have proper sunlight. So she has to arrive home every single day and see the plants in her own bedroom. And finally, okay, yeah. And finally, the third aspect, which comprises these material dimensions, it's just a word about the material dimensions when thinking about what happens when home is an economic asset. So when home is an economic asset, you need to invest on it according to your work needs. So in this sense, housing stability directly affects home as an economic unit. So of course that if you live under the threat of eviction, it will be very difficult to adapt your house to the activities that you are carrying. But consider also that even if you pay rent, in some cases, you cannot invest in your business, you cannot expand the workshop, you cannot improve the roof that's covering the inventory, you cannot change the layout of the kitchen to cook whatever you need to cook. You cannot build another room for rental. You can even put an address in your business card, or you can even apply to be a regular vendor at a fair close to home because you might have to move. So these are just a few examples showing how securing housing literally means securing work and income for urban majorities, which of course comprises the relationship with state regulations, especially when auto construction takes place to expand homes for work purposes, like you see in the bottom picture. So yeah, this work is still ongoing. I hope you have enjoyed it. And if you have any comments or suggestions, please get in touch. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Rodrigo. Thank you so much. Rodrigo, by the way, just won best PhD dissertation by the Urban Studies Association of Brazil. Yes.
No, in realtà non sta venendo.
Well done, Rodrigo.
Doveva venire un'amica, adesso mi ha detto che non sta venendo.
At home, please just mute your mic. Thank you very much. Okay, so we move on with the next presentation from our dear Devra Waldman. Devra also just returned from fieldwork. So please come here and tell us everything about this interesting place.
Okay. Hi, everybody. As Michele mentioned, my name is Devra. I originally come from Canada, but I've been doing work in the National Capital Region of India for quite a long time. And so I've tentatively titled, because everything is tentative, this presentation, Inhabiting the Afterlives of Extended Urbanization in Noida. And really this comes from an interest in how the city as a unit itself is being made, unmade, and remade through housing interventions. So I have to give a little bit of context on the city to in order for you to understand where I'm going in terms of this, these various housing interventions. And I've been interested in the National Capital Region for a long time, and more recently in this place called Noida, which stands for the New Ogla Industrial Development Authority, which was created in 1976. just on the southeast side of Delhi. And I'm interested in it because it's quite a peculiar place in the National Capital Region, but also because of its political and social context. It's been explicitly envisioned as an extension of Delhi, but also the future for Delhi and the savior for all of its development, housing, and environmental problems. And so it's been subject to a variety of experiments of what the urban and housing future could look like. And I'm just going to quickly walk through 3 ideas of this future. The first future was the one from 1976 to the early 1980s. And this was the industrial future. Noida was set up as an industrial authority with the explicit goal of moving polluting industries outside of Delhi to this part of India in order to reduce overcrowding, congestion, and pollution, and to move all of these low-income workers to this space as well. But this industrial future didn't last very long. In the early 1980s, the city was explicitly reoriented towards the housing future, where they reduced the industrial land allocation by 60% within a period of 2 years. But this was the state-led housing future, the housing future for the low and lower middle income class residents. And this was through state schemes that supported this kind of development. This changed again in the 1990s with economic liberalization and more federal orientations of the country towards attracting global capital, producing global cities, et cetera. And Noida kind of jumped on this bandwagon. And so now you see large incentives for private developers to build large-scale group housing projects for this idea of the global future. But none of these futures ever arrived as such, not the industrial, not the state housing, not the global housing future. And the city seems trapped kind of in purgatory and waiting for all of these different futures to arrive. And the most recent federal auditor general report on the city has revealed a serious housing and city-making crisis, where despite the city acquiring over 12,000 hectares of land for residential development, in the last 20 years, 65% of it is completely unfinished. And what makes this really interesting is because Noida is an industrial authority, it has no democratic electoral representation. Currently, at this point, there's roughly an estimated population of 2 million people, and it's controlled by a CEO and a board of directors that are appointed by the state. And this is the same at the village level too, which often tends to be exempt from these kinds of orientations. In 2015, they removed village leadership because they deemed it wasn't necessary in an industrial township, even though there's no industry here. So this is the context in which I'm doing this research. And that brings me to my questions, which first I want to say I came to this project through the framework of extended urbanization, which is how cities extend themselves beyond urban agglomerations into rural space through capitalist expansion, and how peripheries become reintegrated into the city of the urban fabric in metropolitan centers through industrial production and extractivism. And this makes sense in Noida. It was always seen as an extension. But because of these ideas of the future, I started to wonder about how ideas of futures, temporalities, competing temporalities, shape and reshape what is constitutive of city making here and how this takes place through housing specifically. So these are my 2 questions. The first is how extensions reflect competing and multiple ideas of the future, and how I think what is more interesting to me is how different groups position themselves in relation to these kinds of futures that are coming, eventually going to come. And this I'm thinking alongside Abdul Malik Simone, who's the co-leader of our lab, about how these different temporalities exist at the same time. The second question is how this facilitates and enables other ways of inhabiting, making, unmaking, and remaking the city. What kind of surprises might operate in this kind of structure with no democratic representation, all kinds of things that are taking place here. And here is a nod also to our fearless leader, Michele, and his idea of the propositional politics. What could be happening here that we don't really see? And so in slight difference to Rodrigo, and you'll see Daniela and Chiara to a degree a bit later, they're talking about the home as like an individual unit in a sense. I'm talking about the home at the scale of the city here and the relationship between the home and the city. I just came back like 10 days ago from a very short 12-day trip to Delhi where I was trying to get a sense of this city. I did 4 key interviews with past CEOs of the city, past heads of urban planning of the city, some journalists. And really I spent a lot of time just going around the city, trying to understand it. And I've also been doing a lot of archival work on the city master plans and how the city's been developed. So everything that I'm going to talk about today is very, very, very preliminary. And I'm going to split this into 3 key findings. I'm interested mostly here is that the city seemed like a bet. Housing and the city were bets on different kinds of futures. Different people were making different bets on what this looked like. And I'm going to talk about 3 key bets. The first is the developer and upper middle class speculative bet on the non-city. The second is the village and migratory labor bets on ongoing demolitions, constructions, and domestic work in the city that is there and is coming. And the third is the state and the city bet on starting over completely because they've just given up. So when I went to Noida, this was the advertisement for my Airbnb. These are the images from the Airbnb. And I thought this would be a pretty good place to get a sense of the city. It was very close to the metro. It'd be safe for me to get in and out. It seemed to look like this, and I'd be really high up. Like, I thought it would be kind of cool to be on a high floor overlooking the city to get a sense of place. But what I didn't realize is that I would be like personally living the aftermath of extended urbanization in this place. So if this is what the pictures look like, why is it stuck? This is the reality of where I found myself. What was not disclosed at all was that this was a complete open construction site. Oh, what is happening? There we go. It was a complete open construction site. It was fully under construction. This is the tallest building in the entire city. And I was all alone. I was the only person inhabiting this entire building by myself. And the last photo, which is my personal favorite on the bottom right, I got stuck in the elevator one day and the elevator would only open on the 2nd floor, where if I stepped out of the elevator, I would fall to my death onto a pile of concrete. And I then obviously didn't feel safe here. I spent a week here and then I was the only person here and felt like I needed to leave. And when I looked at other places to go, I saw that there was 4 other listings for apartments in this building. And what I think is really interesting here is that this is like an example of the upper middle class speculative bet on the non-city. Like, there's no evidence that this place was ever going to be complete, to be honest. Like, the company is under insolvency issues, they're bankrupt, they have a whole bunch of projects in the city. But my Airbnb host was saying that, you know, he invested in this to like rent it out as Airbnb. Like, the people who own these units, they have no intention of ever inhabiting the space. The space was uninhabitable, and it might never be that way. But this is also reflective of a broader developer bet on the non-city, on the speculative non-city. And the Noida Authority provided all these lucrative incentives for developers to get long leases to land, take down payments from middle-class investors, which they never used to build their projects. They just took that capital and launched projects elsewhere and elsewhere and elsewhere in the city. So this one example is one of many ghost towers, ghost unfinished projects that are all over the city, haunting the city everywhere you go. And there's no incentive for them to complete them. And now all of these developers have defaulted on their payments to tens to hundreds of billions of dollars. So they are not going to ever be complete. And what I think is also really interesting is, despite this incompleteness, my favorite, there's advertisements everywhere on the highways about new projects being launched in the city. And my favorite one is the one on the top left, where the company has changed the name Noida to Noidia, but they don't realize that it also says no idea, that they have like no idea. And then underneath it says trust. I don't know what else it says, but it's like they've no trust, no development, no timely delivery. And like, it's so reflective of the city. No one has any idea what is going on there. And then they also use like the darkness of the city to portray a different kind of future. So this building is the same building that I was inhabiting. They like at nighttime, like put lights on the building to show that it is finished, that it's complete, that they can use the darkness to project a different city that is there. And I say this is the non-city because this version of the city, it's impossible for it to arrive at this point. But this brings me to the village and migratory labor bets on ongoing construction and demolition in the city. And this is a very different bet that's taking place at this level, because these are the parts of the city where people are actually occupying space. And the first two images on the, I don't know my lefts and rights, the right. Yeah, the right. One of them is a demolition site. One of them is another like housing construction. And these spaces have temporary shanty housing built by the migratory laborers that live in this space to either demolish projects that are not going to be complete or to build projects that might also never be complete. So here you have these migratory populations moving through these projects, project to project to project. And then the other two on the left are, the one in the middle is an advertisement for what's called a one-room set, where this could be a family that would move in. This would be like, you know, security staff or domestic workers, maids. I'd say most of them likely are security workers, where they would occupy these small rooms, sometimes one family, sometimes many workers coming to the city. And the backside of this, these houses look like this, where you can see that these are occupied. But this is the space where like people are, and 2 minutes. Okay, I'm almost done. These are the spaces where people are, but it's also the part of the city. Like on the one hand, you have the ghost uninhabited city, and this is the extremely overpopulated city where people are coming in, where you have really serious overcrowding issues. The people who rent out these spaces, these village rentiers, are people who've received compensation for getting their land allocated, and now they're supporting this rentier economy of migratory labor that's going to sustain and build this idea of the future city. And the state planners had told me that like they had never planned for this. They didn't plan for these populations to be here, these villages to be here. They just kind of happened. And now you have the last bet. And this is the state and the city bet on starting all over again. And because the city is in crisis, as I mentioned, 65% of the housing is completely incomplete. They've had a whole host of very interesting interventions into land and housing. The first, the one on the left, is the demolition of 2 nearly complete 100-story towers that came down in August because they violated planning laws in the city. Everything violates planning laws, but these ones subject to demolition. The one in the middle is over 100, this is one photo of over 100 demolitions of farmhouses that took place on the Yamuna River. And farmhouses are the houses of the ultra rich. These are mansions, as you can see, in the city. And I think the third bet, like, so you have two here on starting over, on just like reclaiming the land to try again, maybe in some sense. But the third is the day I arrived, the Noida Authority decided to approve a budget of 1,000 crore, which is roughly like 100 million euros, let's say, to acquire land in 80 more villages on the hinterland of Noida to create what they've called New Noida. So they've just, I don't know, like given up, and they're going to try to start over new again on the hinterland. So you have Noida, you have Greater Noida, and you have New Noida. So these are like the competing temporalities that exist here all at the same time. And this will bring me to the end, where it brings me back to my research questions, where these different temporalities, competing ideas of the future, how different groups really are positioning themselves in relation to these ideas of the future are taking place through land and through housing in the making and unmaking of the city. And this is just the beginning. I hope to be able to do more fieldwork on this in the future, but these are just some preliminary thoughts. So along with Rodrigo, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or feedback, I'd be super grateful. Thanks so much for listening.
That was very good. Thank you, Devra. Very good. I love this theoretical framework on betting. I really do. Actually, this is interesting. Now we move on, but as part of my new book project, I'm starting some work in Cairo, and some of the things that she showed us in Noida are actually happening also in Cairo, which is quite interesting. Okay, so thank you very much, Devra. Now we are going to move on, and we have 2 more presentations to go. And the next one is from our dear Chiara Cacciotti. Chiara is going to present around her work in Rome, and without further ado, I'll leave it to you. Thank you, Chiara.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Michele was saying, I am Chiara, I'm from Rome, and I'm studying in Rome actually right now. And the title of my presentation, as you can see, is The Aftermath of Eviction, Homemaking and Radical Practices in the Lives of Former Squatters in Rome. It introduces the preliminary thoughts and outcomes of an ongoing ethnographic research for this ERC project. So as Devra and Rodrigo, please be patient also with me because it's still an ongoing research. And in particular, I will focus on the post-eviction phenomenon. And by that, I mean the social, affective, and political effects that eviction have had and still have on the life of former and also current squatters in Rome, because sometimes after an eviction, what happens is that people find themselves again in the squatting system because there are no alternatives. So with this research, I am to deepen the geography of the housing paths of those who have lived or still live in occupations for housing purposes managed by the Roman housing right movements and who have undergone one or more evictions over the last 3 decades. But more importantly, through some in-depth, open and semi-structured interviews, because I have a background in anthropology, unfortunately, so I'm quite stuck in this ethnographic model, but the research explores whether people who used to join squatting movements still perform radical political practices, or if they stopped, together if they have incorporated these radical practices in their living and housing situation, in their current living and housing situation. And I apologize in advance since this presentation will be more ethnographic than theoretical, but let's go to the research question that can be summarized in a single one that I am investigating the most right now, which is this one. How is the housing political articulated and not necessarily announced in the aftermath of eviction? Or to put it in another way, if it is true that squats can be defined as educational sites of resistance, as Carlotta Cacciotti has put it, what happened to what they politically learned inside squats? Is there I don't know, a pedagogy of the political also afterward? Can the radical practices learned inside squats be considered as an extension of home? Thanks, Rodrigo, for that. Even when home becomes something else. So in this case, after an eviction occurs, and this is also to recall what Michele was saying before, citing Turner, that the problem also here is not what housing is, but what housing does on the lives of people, even when that housing, so the squat, becomes something else. So the general question can be further split into 2 more specific research trajectories. The first one is if and how it intersects, and by that I mean the housing political, if and how it intersects with their current homemaking practices. And then the second one is if and how does it intersect with their radical practices. And for this brief presentation, I decided to compare 2 interviews that I made of 2 former squatters, Fabrizio and Ahmed, that we will see in a while. They are interesting not only because they both experienced several evictions during their lives as squatters, but also because they reflect 2 different visions about their new domestic situation and their current radical practices that occurred in the aftermath of their squatting experience. Right now, Fabrizio, who is also the spokesperson of one housing right movement in Rome, lives in a building that used to be a squat, but then in 2004 was regularized by the local municipality, becoming in this way public housing. On the contrary, Ahmed, that we will see, is an Eritrean man, but born and grew up in Rome, who still doesn't have the Italian citizenship. And he used to join the housing movements, but now he joined other political movements, such as Black Lives Matter Rome. And he lives in a, let's say, more conventional council flat. In this first case, all the former squatters are still living there. They just became public housing tenants, but the collective dimension partially still exists. In the second case, Ahmed experienced a reallocation process that split the community throughout the city. So they all share a displacement process. Here, Fabrizio says that he misses the collective dimension of living in a squat and the relational and more educational dimension of daily learning new political instruments, even though he started to get bored at a certain point, because in a squat, the boundary between the collective and the individual domestic sphere is quite blurred. And people knock on your door for anything at any time of day and night, so it can be quite annoying sometimes. But he misses that dimension anyhow, which now has become more ordinary, even though that one isn't an ordinary building, but a former squat. And on the other hand, Ahmed has a different perception of his current domestic situation. He had never lived in a proper house before and during his squat experience, where he lived for 16 years in the squat where he lived before the eviction. He used to live in places such as boarding schools or the street. Consequently, now that he lives in a council flat, he is more satisfied than before. And he motivated this by saying, home is also your neighbor. It's also the shop underneath you. It's also like getting to know the area around you. And when you're thrown into dynamics such as the lack of a home, you can't just put down roots in the place where you live, because then you live at the mercy of what can happen. And by that, he means the evictability factor, as Van Baar has put it. So the risk of being constantly evicted, or the difficulty of getting some rights like the citizenship, as in his case. And this is also peculiar because Ahmed used to live in a squat in the very city center, which is also a very petty bourgeoisie area. So for this reason, they weren't able to set a relationship with the surrounding community. And he defined this mechanism as something far from you, but which manages your sense of belonging to that territory and that space. So he basically never felt at home before his current accommodation in a council house. So that's the reason why there are two different experiences. But the confrontation between the two is also interesting regarding the maintenance of radical practices after an eviction. Because after 2004, Fabrizio and the other spokespersons of the movement stopped to live in squat because they all live in this public housing building. And this became quite an issue because, as he says, the distance from the squat made us assume some things. At one point, you start to think that things must be done in a certain way, but slowly you realize that you cannot fully understand or perceive internal issues, and this creates a distance. Since you no longer live there, you need to relearn some things. The other spokesperson and I were no longer living in squats, and we didn't see the dimension from the inside anymore. We tried to imagine some things, but it is one thing to assume and another to know that experience directly. So in this sense, although in the previous slide, Ahmed was pretty pessimistic, and contrary to Fabrizio, he isn't part of the housing movement anymore. When I asked Ahmed if he brought something with him regarding practices and experience related to the struggle for housing in its current Black Lives Matter Rome activist, he said something quite fascinating, because he said the struggle for housing for him is not only coincides with living in a squat. That experience has also been the picklock with which I interacted with other political realities that, for example, deal with migrant issues or other struggles. So that was a starting point and a political and pedagogical experience also in a certain way. Without that experience, which he somehow criticizes, but he would have been someone afraid to renew his residence permit, someone who stands only on its own and only thinks about surviving and having a house, a job, etc. And if now he can politically criticize and fight against the policies made on issues that concern him, like the migrant one, it is thanks to that experience, to that housing experience. Consequently, although he stopped to join the housing movement, he recognized a sort of political capital born in that experience that he now uses for other means and other struggles that concern his life. So Before I started my research, many people in the field outlined to me two main after squatting patterns of behavior. On the one hand, some people perpetuate the modes of behavior and relationships acquired in squats. And the prevailing sentiment here is the fear of being unable to face the new situation. Therefore, maintaining the community sphere is considered reassuring. And on the other hand, a significant part also retires to private life over time, while sometimes maintaining the openness mentioned earlier. But when I started interviewing, this binary, this sharp model immediately became more nuanced, more blurred in its outlines. Only considering Fabrizio and Annette's experiences, it was already possible to add some, let's say, in-between position between these two poles. For instance, there are people who stop living in squats and they stop carrying on radical practices, but still feel a sense of nostalgia and a loss of the sociality and mutual aid that they experienced there. Or there are people who are just glad of having conquered a council flat and finally feel themselves at home for the very first time, even though they are still politically involved in many struggles. And again, there are people who are still fighting inside the housing movements, in this case as a spokesperson, while at the same time suffering from a distance from previous life concerns that doesn't allow them to interpret the internal needs of still existing squats. There are people like Ahmed who were tired from the housing struggle, but are still using that knowledge inside other forms of struggle. So this picture is far from complete, and maybe it will never be complete. And that's the main difficulty of this research, because it's all about collecting fragments, as I was saying with Michele some days ago, with the aim not of elaborating a super theory of the post-eviction phenomenon, but to render the complexity of these living experiences and the different geographical and political trajectories that people can take, even when they don't define their condition as political. Consequently, in this research, home can be considered not only a matter of physical infrastructures and relationships, but also a political and pedagogical experience to me. Then what I'm trying to define here as political capital. And by that, I mean attention, a chance to perceive social injustices and discriminations while actively finding means and building knowledge for fighting against them. In a nutshell, this research will not only outline the main post-eviction housing trajectories, but also bring out the transformative political potential of this almost always invisible experience. And to conclude, I don't know if I have 1 minute, okay? My next step will be going on with the interviews of former and current squatters, together with former and current institutional representatives that have managed evictions in Rome. At the same time, I am following these key debates that I think represent preliminary insights useful for the research angle that I want to assume. Of course, the concept of evictability by Van Baar that I mentioned before, then how it is and how it was to live with the constant possibility of being removed from a sheltering place. Also papers that have investigated displacement, but from a more experiential point of view, while keeping in mind that, well, as Roland Atkinson pointed out, to measure displacement is like trying to measure the invisible. So will be quite hard to do that. And finally, literature on how is the housing political articulated to the materiality of homing processes, looking at the assemblage of the post-eviction from a broader experiential point of view, capable of revealing if and how an affirmative self-grounding politics of home can emerge from alleged dispossessed dwellings. And that's it, and thank you for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you, Chiara. Very well done. Thank you. I know it's hard to move on one after the other, but if we do it this way, we will have more time at the end for conversation. And now we are moving actually to the last, but not least, of course, presented for today. Exactly.
Thanks for the patience.
Actually, she asked me, why do I always come last? And Devra just said it.
That's
Save
not
the best for last.
too high expectations.
Yeah, exactly. Now you can. So Daniela Morpurgo, and then I wrap up. We take a break and we move to discussion. Daniela.
So, thank you again. Yes, I'm Daniela, and as the huge title say, I'm talking about sex work and inhabitation in Italy. I will start with some premises and direction to frame what I'm speaking about. I am interested, of course, in how sex work intersects with housing and inhabitation. And sex work can be defined as the negotiated exchange of sexual and or affective activities for money or other material resources. The fact is that when sexuality comes to be associated with a market, a whole set of moral judgments, stigma, specific regulation come into play. And in specific case of Italy, where is my research based, prostitution is legit but unregulated, and all conducts associated with prostitution are deemed illegal for either favoring, exploiting, or trafficking in prostitution. This mixture of regulation and stigma affects how people, sex workers, can navigate its spaces, including homes. Why then I think it's important to speak of this relation? Well, mostly because we know nothing about it. Most geographical literature looking at sex work so far has done it in relation to public spaces, red light districts, streets, or when speaking of forced sex work, to borders. But there is almost no literature that looks at closed spaces as spaces of dwelling and working. When coming to sex work, the house has been removed from geographical imagination. And this is paradoxical if considering that in Italy, as in most of Europe and also other continents, most prostitution occurs indoor. So before getting to the core, and my presentation too will be very empirical and not much theoretical, I will tell you what kind of field activities, through what kind of field activities I'm unraveling this interconnection. First, I'm slowly taking interview with sex worker. Second, since 8 months, I'm being part of one of the very few sex worker-led association, which is called SWIPE. And my activities as an activist include being one of the main reference for an activist-led research on migration, housing, and sex work, financed by the European Sex Work Alliance, contributing to the organization of the first Italian Sex Worker Congress in 22 years, and it's going to be a mess, but very important. Sending a request for Antipod Research Activist Grant together with other groups and researchers. And I have organized and attended a sex work retreat to record a podcast that will serve for fundraising. While I say this, I wish to underscore that the fact that sex work activism is my first way into this world also means that so far, and this might change, I'm mostly talking with the most privileged part of sex work. What I mean is that in sex work, there is a so-called power hierarchy, and my interlocutors are not the very, very top, but comparatively in this frame are well off. As another activities, I have started volunteering in a protected house here in Turin for women exiting situation of trafficking. And here so far, I have also conducted interviews to operators and volunteers, and I will shortly start a photographic workshop with the women in the house. As a preliminary result of this research, I would like to share some of the words of the sex workers. I have identified at least 8 ways, 8 interconnections between inhabitation and sex work. The first, perhaps is the more obvious, being a sex worker is a strong barrier to access housing. Take, for instance, what a Can girl told me. She lives in Bologna, which is a city where the housing competition is very strong. There are actual castings to select who gets the room in a house. And she, reflecting on how to introduce herself during this sort of casting, says,
okay, I am a freshman in university. I don't have anyone who knows me here, so I can say that. Then I cannot say that I am a sex worker because maybe that could be an element against me. So I don't say that. I can say that I am a student, that I'm not straight. Let's see, who can tell that, who show up in front of me. This is to say that there is a clear selection of what can be said and what cannot be said to get in a house. She told me clearly, I started to make a list of things to say and not to say. That of being a sex worker cannot be said if you want to get a room or a house or any place to stay. And even when you get a place, sex work and how people react to it is a constant factor of strong insecurity, of possible evictability. In the words of one girl, beyond the issue of finding the flat and then getting it rented and paying it off, there is a whole question of the neighborhood. You are quite constantly anxious that the neighbor or the doorman will somehow find you about you. So I don't know, you are always anxious that you are going to have guards arriving at your house at any moment, or that the neighbors are going to rat you out to the agency rather than to the owner of the house. So maybe you are going to get kicked out of the flat at any moment. In a quite casual conversation, another sex worker expressed this sentiment even more clearly. She said, I realize that this state of insecurity is not abnormal, but it's the norm. For us, sex workers, the home is not a safe place, or rather it can become so, but only after a long time. And it is a situation that can change at any time. So despite what one may think, these factors are not only to access and stay in regular private market, but also in politicized squats, or at least in some of them, since there is big differences. This is a brief extract of the experience of one sex worker who has been squatting in Milan for a quite long time. And she said, then I also happened to live for long periods of time in squatted apartments. And this is a really pitiful chapter in the sense that you really understand how much social stigma there is about sex work, because it just so happens that occupied spaces are welcoming to everyone except sex worker. And the experience of this woman is that she was literally kicked out of the apartment she squatted herself. And all these problems that sex workers have in accessing and maintaining a place of whatever kind, as one of the main consequences, the creation of a parallel exploitative informal markets. This is how they explain it to me. As a sex worker, you will receive millions of contacts of messages in which they offer you to rent a flat. Let me explain it in more details. Many times in chat, you receive contact like, hello, I am Gianpaolo, I have this flat. They rent at an inflated price, and many of them are either sublet or do other scams. She said that she advises nobody to trust these offers because you might be fined, you might be just ripped off, or you might get things different from what you ever agreed on. Also, in most of the above cases, there is an issue of relations with other people living in the apartment, sex worker, and of well-being, therefore. Sex workers are constantly obliged to lie, also inside the house, because of the stigma and the fear of getting evicted or judged, and of the regulation that make illegal any conduct that is somehow related to prostitution, so even somehow renting. This was the frustration of one of the girls I spoke to in relation to her housing situation. She says, it is not really the right housing condition to be able to tell them what I do, and yet I hope one day to perhaps find housemates of people who are able to take these things in. These things is she being a sex worker. I no longer feel comfortable in having to pretend so much. Anyway, not being able to tell anything, not being able to always having to hide everything. And as I said before, but I would like you to keep this in mind, all these interviews are taken with the most privileged part of sex work, and still you have all these issues and layer and obstacles of stigma and problems coming from the regulation. But let's move on. The housing situation also determines how the work is carried out materially. It determines if you work at home, outside, in what room, the aspiration you have, even at what times of the day you work. The first citation, for instance, comes from a male sex worker who lives in a squatted public house, and his room is contiguous to the kitchen. He does work only outside the home, and he says, in my imagination, I would certainly like to have the opportunity to have my home. Also, I don't know, in a squat, in a commune, in the middle of the woods, I don't know, but I would like to have my own room and one more space where to work. Because the thing is that I absolutely cannot fuck for work in my room. I see it as an intimate private place and I want to keep it like that. On top of this, the housing condition not only determines how sex work is conducted, but but also what kind of legal pathways are allowed to take. Are you allowed to take if you are a migrant woman, and what kind of dwelling can you or you have to live in? This is particularly the case for those who start the procedure to ask permit to stay in Italy and are found to be in exploitative forms of sex work. For instance, a social operator working in a protected house where I'm volunteering explained with this word how women enter in the house, in the protected house. When she, the woman, had the interview with our colleague, emerged how there were elements that could be traced back to trafficking, and therefore she was placed inside the safe house Gabriella. This is one of the possible ways to be at Gabriella House. Another one of the possible ways to the toll-free number, in the sense that anyone can contact the toll-free number and say that she's in a situation of exploitation and she does not have another housing solution, and therefore the whole machine of hosting is activated. Finally, and I'm going to conclude, after all these points where I underline the connection between housing, inhabitation, and sex work, but somehow with a problematic note related to stigma, insecurity, and lack of support, there is a positive side, because sex workers, when there is the possibility of coming together in a house, might also create incredible moments of sharing and affection. At the beginning of the presentation, I very rapidly shared that a couple of weeks ago, me, other 10 sex workers from Swipe, the association which I'm part, and other few people went in a collective retreat, and it was honestly incredible. The one you see on the screen are not just the 3 asses, but also the impression we shared afterwards. And I mean, I've been in many collective situations before, but none like this. And I believe it was also, or mostly, because it was a retreat among sex workers. It was one of the very few safe spaces where they could be together and speak freely. It was, I think, the first situation I've been where people who, many of them, only knew each other online, did not even have to decide who was sleeping with whom, how to allocate the beds. There was a general sense of trust, trusting also that everyone would respect others' borders if needed. To conclude, and as a general synthesis, overall geographical literature on sex work has missed that the act of exchanging sex for money or other material resources implies specific ways of accessing housing and inhabiting it, while I think that there is a whole world at this interaction. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you. Okay, before we take a short break, allow me to try to wrap some of these things up. so that then we can move to the discussion. And how can you unwrap these things up? I want to say that I didn't know how to do an ERC project before having one. I really had no idea. I had some colleagues before me with a project like this, and I think I've noticed that you can do this kind of projects in two ways. One way is you have a very strong idea and you just tell people what to do. And I think that's a totally legitimate way. Actually, I think this is the way in which the ERC wants ERC projects to be run. I have chosen a different path, which I'm taking actually from other colleagues. For instance, my friend Colin McFarlane has done the same. My friend Vanessa Castambrot has done the same. You have an idea and you use that idea as a framework. And then you ask people to write their own projects. So that's what they did, all of them. The first thing I told them when they came to Turin was, take time to write a paper out of your PhD. And second, do write a project about how you interpret my project. So each one of them has done this. And that's why we have this variety. That's why we have this multiplicity. But I am very proud of it. I'm proud of this sense of richness, because in doing that, and now I'm going to make them feel ashamed. In doing that, you have a very powerful recollection of very nuanced ways of asking different questions within the same framework. And so we heard from Mara about ways. So I said before, this is not a project about policy, but it's a project where there is a space to try to understand how people from below, if you allow me, are trying to reimagine a possibility for housing to become policy. And I think this is what Mara is doing. I think what Anna is doing is to try to understand how internationalism is built around the question of housing. And it's doing that in a very complex geographical setting with very different histories. Veda is bringing her experience of organizing into this project. I met Veda in the streets of Bucharest. I had the privilege of seeing her in action as an organizer, and I know the amazing work she did within the coalition, and she's bringing that work into the project. Again, about translocal organizing. Again, around the ways in which you can make internationalism, but within a context where there are clear colonial legacies at play, the European context. And then you come to this guy, and everybody laughs. Hey, he gave me the picture. I didn't choose the picture, okay? The thing here is about, we are moving from these questions of policies and this question of translocal organizing into situated forms of practices, okay? Each one of them, the four that are coming now, are tackling into issues that are completely understudied, especially when it comes to the geography, the literature around housing in geographies and urban studies. So the intersection between popular economies, urban extension, and housing has not been asked in the ways in which Rodrigo is asking that question. The importance of material cultures, the importance in which the intimacy of place and space within household is organized in order to be functional or dysfunctional in relation to questions of habitation. This is a very novel question. Devra questions is novel on a number of levels. The geographical setting, the first time Devra told me, I want to do research on Noida, there is no literature on it. And I thought, yeah, sure. Actually, there is no literature on the place. Literally, there is very little on this place. Now, the ways in which, there are geopolitical elements, there are elements of land grabbing, there are conflicting aspirations that are intersecting in that very complex case of Noida. Everything read through, again, the question of housing and the question of how housing renders certain places habitable or completely uninhabitable. Chiara's question is a very peculiar one, and one that is very close to my heart. It's the question of, we are talking about the political of housing, how that political transcends the experiential. There is the question of time. It's the question of moving out certain kind of politically dense and charged settings, and what do you bring with yourself? That the aftermath of eviction was one of the original ideas has been completely overlooked in terms of how that lingers through after the moment of eviction. And then finally, Daniela. Daniela is coming, her PhD, and Francesco Chiodelli knows this very well. Her PhD is about religion, it's about, it's a completely different thing, completely different, but it makes sense for me to say this because if everyone else is developing things that somewhat they have done in the past, for Daniela, it's a completely new field. It's a completely new field in terms of the literature available. There is literally zero in terms of housing and sex work. There is some literature coming from movements and organizing, but very little from scholarship. And she didn't have experience in that field. And in a little bit less than 18 months, she has done amazingly well in asking questions, and actually today, impressively so, in already providing some analytics. This was extremely exciting. So what I want to say in terms of concluding, the key question of the project is around how do people inhabit the radical potential of housing? We have heard a number of ways through which this question can be asked. The question here is not housing as the ultimate end point of something, but housing as the analytical prism through which you ask the question of the political. Now you might have the question of how do you hold this together? I don't want to hold it together. This picture, this series of pictures is a little project of mine. I love photography, and I've been spending 4 years of my life in Sheffield. Sheffield, as Ryan maybe can say, it's a relatively gray city. It's not particularly colorful. These are pictures of garage doors that I have been taking in Sheffield. Do they tell a story about garage doors in Sheffield? No. Do they tell a story about Sheffield per se? No. But in just opposing them, they create a form of, they have an affective capacity of sort. In being together, they tell a story, but in this case, it's totally related to photography, but they do tell a story, they tell something. And this is the way I have conceived this particular project. This is a project in which a number of people are asking an epistemological question that I posed at the beginning of the project. How can we rethink and reimagine the housing political? This is my epistemological question to them, and they are taking it and they are inhabiting that question through a number of different intersections and propositions. And on the side, we have this collective study element. And for me, ultimately, and here I close, this is what we are going to bring to scholarship. I don't give a damn if what we are doing is not of relevance to policy. Other people do this work better. This is not the work that we are doing. The work that we are doing is about providing, and I'm particularly thinking about our students, providing our students a set of lenses through which they can ask the housing question for today's global urban world in a different way. It's about providing new kind of insights and methodological tools, which need to be different because the housing question is different and its potential is different according to histories and geographies. So these are my 2 cents in terms of wrapping things for now. I propose to take a 15 minutes break, and then we're going to have finally a discussion with a number of amazing people that we have here today in the room. Thank you very much. So at home, we'll come back in 15. Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Hi. Surely you missed my voice, right? So I was saying, I was just introducing the discussion. Thank you, Chiara. And indeed, I can ask everyone, please, to give a round of applause to Chiara Cacciotti, who has been, Chiara has been helping with the chat, with the online Zoom. So thank you very much, Chiara. Okay, so we have 5 people here. As I was saying, these are scholars I really admire and friends. And they are going to give some provocations and maybe some feedback on what we did today. So we are joined by Nadia Caruso. Nadia is a colleague from this department. Nadia has been looking at issues of housing for many years. So I'm really interested in hearing her take on what we are doing. Then we will move to another colleague of this department and good friend, Francesco Chiodelli, who's also been looking at housing for years, among other things. So I'm looking at him again for suggestions and thoughts. Then we are going to Erin McElroy. Erin is also a good friend. They are a co-founder of the Radical Housing Journal with a number of other people in this room. Erin is also going to deliver a seminar here on Thursday. So yes, we paid for their airfare, but we are making them work for it. So thank you very much, Erin, for being here. And then another very good friend of mine, Ryan Powell. Ryan, one of my best mates in Sheffield. I'm so happy that he's here today. He has been looking at housing in the UK and more lately migration as well. And then last but not least, another good friend of many of us in the room, Margherita Grazioli. Margherita has done extensive research around housing in Italy, and she's also a prominent housing activist in Rome. So without further ado, I'll ask maybe Nadia to start, and then we move on before having a final conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michele, for inviting me, and to all the people of the lab. It was really an interesting chance to hear all your work. And I have to say that I was kind of surprised because this is really a multiple frame of such a different and interesting research. So, I mean, it's really a pleasure for me. What I should start with? Well, first of all, you have to know that I'm a planner, so I have, I mean, a different angle of looking at things. So the first comment is for Michele, because I was wondering, after all this space, what you call the collective study, what is going to be? I'm curious about it. And regarding the other, I try to ask few general suggestion comments, and then maybe to deal with some specific aspects. First of all, I'm quite funded about situated knowledge and local contextualized research. So in some cases, I found really difficult to find those aspects. I'm sure that this is related to the stage and in which phase of your research you are, and of course the few minutes that you have to express and your case study. But it would be interesting for me to understand better those contexts and try to understand better in which, I mean, which is the frame and which is the place specificities. So I mean, the mortgage condition, the eviction condition, the rates. I know that you don't like that so much, but as you can see, my draft and my notes are behind a map. So I mean, I'm also fond of quantitative data. So this is my general comment. And then I was wondering, especially about the movement and the internationalism that both Anna and Veda talked about. I mean, I was wondering if you can detail more the role of these movements, like their agency, their tools, their targets. I'm sure that they are different considering the different, I mean, places and contexts compared, of
course, such a different places from I mean Europe to USA and Latin America. So, but then what kind of interest do they have? What empowers them? So I mean, Hannah talked about education, but I also heard about knowledge production. So I mean, they have also different kind of goals. So I mean, what is there any common trend or frame or not? I mean, both is fine, but it would be interesting to understand this kind of dimension. Then regarding a general comment about the 4 cases, the one of Rodrigo, Devra, Chiara, and Daniela, I was wondering if you maybe could deal more with the spatial inequalities also. So are there any differences concerning the urban dimension of those phenomena? Are there any difference concerning the inner cities or the broader area, the actual inequalities that are part of those specific case studies are also reflected in their spatial dimension or not? Or maybe yes. So this sort of intersection could be interesting to deal with, to go into that, And then it would be really nice if the concept that Mara and Anna and Deva started with could intersect really the case studies. I know that maybe it's just a preliminary phase of the case studies, but it would be interesting to see how those talk with each other, or they don't maybe. Okay, I don't know if I said too much or too less, but I leave the floor to Francesco. Right?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Nadia.
Okay, yesterday we received a message by Michele saying you have 8 minutes for commenting.
Yeah.
And when I read this message, I said, oh, come on, it would not be enough. So I would have to squeeze what I have to say. But then today I'm realizing that maybe it's too much. In the sense that if I would, to be frank, I had just to say congratulations. Wow, it's really an excellent word. So what I can say more of this? Unfortunately, the academic environment is very performative, so I cannot stop here. And that's why I have to say something clever. Unfortunately, there are two problems with this. The first one is the first alternative is being pleonastic, stressing the relevance and the originality of your research, but you did for 4 hours. So I mean, I'm respecting all of you in the audience, and I'm not being pleonastic. So what I can do is to comment on the substance of what you said. Unfortunately, to me, there is a problem. If I would comment on the project, I would be arrogant. Come on, you got an ERC. How can I comment now in 8 minutes your whole project? And I would be epistemologically incorrect to comment on all your presentation because, as you said, they are fragments within a whole framework, but they are still fragments. Sometimes it is. And I would be unfair if I would comment on specific presentations. So I would leave my comments for some of you for later. For instance, I'm a bit closer to what Rodrigo said, a bit to what Daniela said, and Devra, so maybe we can chat later during the dinner or even the next day. So what I want to do now in, let's say, 3 or 4 minutes is to say something lateral and also playing my role of a local person. And this latter thing is related to the role of your being here, to your geographical localization, because I think that ontologically speaking, there is always a price to pay to space, and in particular to the place in which you are, meaning in Turin, and this department, and this city. Because I think that there are at least 3 ways of paying this price. The first one is about teaching. You're doing wonderful research, even wonderful empirical research. So I was wondering if you think it's a way to enrich our teaching programs with what you are, not only you, because you have your courses, and not only within your courses. So the first, let's say, stimulus I want to suggest to all of you is to try to interact with some courses which would benefit from this kind of intersection. Also because, as some of you might know, we are now opening an English total program in urban and political geography, which would benefit a lot from some of this work. So the first is about teaching. The second is about the Italian scholarly research on housing, because as we know, research on housing in Italy is quite poor, is quite limited, is also quite disciplinarily limited, much more related to sociology, not almost at all related to planning, just a few people working on geography. So I'm wondering if you are thinking to, in a way, to interact a bit more with the Italian scholarly work. Is not, I mean, it's not necessary, but it's another way to, let's say, to interact with space and paying this price to space. And in this way, maybe also if you plan to publish something in the original language of the countries in which you are, so Italy, but also in other countries, which is also a way to, we always think about this thing of neoliberalism, decolonizing, but I think that a thing we must do is also de-imperialize the academic environment from the Anglo-Saxon imperialism, which is also something, pushing us to publish only in English, which is, I mean, good for many reasons, but I mean, we know that there are other contexts which are still based on national language. So I think that maybe it would be beneficial for the Italian environment also to read something in Italian on your research. And the third point, which is related to this one, is by publishing and writing in Italian, but also in Romanian, in Brazilian, so on and so forth, it's a way to contribute to the public and political discourse on housing, which is, as you said, a central topic, but is extremely weak in terms of counter narratives. And we are perceiving these exactly these days in which we have this mobilization by university students, tents in front of universities, and we see that the discourse is very narrow, both in terms of people contributing to this public discourse, but also in terms of the alternative which are on the ground. I'm referring both to, let's say, more conservative neoliberal alternatives, also to radical alternatives, which are not able to get out of, let's say, mainstream ideas. For instance, think to the proposal to freeze rents, which is something which I have already practiced in the 80s with a lot of problems. So I'm pushing you maybe to try and contribute as much as possible to this Italian debate, because it's something needed. And it's also something needed not only because of the students which are protesting, but also because housing is more and more central in the public discourse. If you think, for instance, to the giant amount of money which has been poured on housing with the under 10% bonus, which is, once again, a great amount of money on housing, and for economic development purposes, but also in terms of environmental question, which is a giant problem from many viewpoints, and giant regressive redistribution of resources, but still we don't have a public informed debate, which is informed only by journalists or just a few scholars. So, and I think that this is a problem of scholars as well. Obviously, it's a problem for parties, for social movements which are not able to enter this discourse, but we can do something. So I was wondering if you think, or you could do something also in order to enter into this debate, in order to, I mean, enrich also the cognitive thinking about the alternatives, but not only the description of the problems, but also the possible way out of this situation. So I'm not saying, I mean, giving to you feedback, suggestion, and provocation, but only, let's say, a hope that you can also enter in these 2.5 years remaining, enter into the Italian debate, which is hot on this question. That's it.
Thank you, Francesco. I honestly forgot who I said was going to be next. Erin, right? Yeah. Okay. So, Erin. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm really so blown away by everybody's presentations, and yeah, thank you for having me here, everybody who made this space possible. But yeah, all of this is a testament, obviously, to all of your work, and I'm really excited too to think about what this means to be a collective study. So I'd love to talk about that more. One major theme that I'm thinking through here is the difference between scaling and creating networks of care and solidarity. And I know often in research projects, there's this impulse to scale. And I know, Michele, you mentioned this kind of desire to scale early on, or to do work outside of just doing in Bucharest. And yet we've also, I know, I have talked about how sometimes scaling creates these sort of fictions of universalism, which of course critical geographers and even geographies have told us to avoid. So then, the impulses are really strong, but it seems that what needs to happen is actually some of the engagements that we heard from earlier in terms of, for instance, a feminist approach to situated knowledge production. I know Mara mentioned Ferreri in terms of making kin, but also obviously situated knowledge requires not scaling, or if scaling, it requires, in order to confront these kind of global capitalist formations, it requires other types of work and other types of commitments. And so there are these amazing networks of solidarity that we learned about today to fight common enemies. I think I saw that, but there's the LA Tenants Union that Anna mentioned. There's the European Action Coalition in Europe. There's the Bloc in Romania. So all of these are forming networks rather than trying to kind of scale a universalist analytic, even if global capital is very real everywhere. It's going to show up differently. And so I think that's just really important to track in all of your projects and how we're framing projects coming together. I think also in terms of care, there's also the care that we have to take as academics in conducting research, given the long history of extractivism in academia. And so again, how do we refrain from being researchers who encourage you into kind of tokenized communities and extract struggles for peer-reviewed publications and academic capital? And that's again something that I see reflected in the ways that a lot of this work was positioned and talked about. I think that the first Mara, that you all really made this clear that we can't do that, and we need instead to engage in, I think what Mara mentioned, movement relevant research, that I mentioned engaged research or activist scholar-based research, also accountability. I think there's a critique of Eurocentric or maybe Western Eurocentric frameworks and epistemologies here we need to think about authorship. There was mention about transnational vision against common enemies. So all of these I think are really important to think through and think with together around the Bolivian and our different sites of research, and how do we really hold them dear as we conduct research across various places together. And I know Mara also mentioned the undercommons, which I was excited to hear, and of course that's the concept that Fred Moten coined, and this really helps us thinking about creating, also nurturing subversive spaces within the university or within academic research communities themselves. And so how do we make the university, or how do we make spaces of research less violent? And I think that's something we can continue to think about. And we know that universities are such violent institutions. In the US, the University of California system is now invested in Blackstone, which we don't know about Blackstone. In New York, NYU and Columbia are the two of the three biggest landlords. The third is the Catholic Church. Harvard and Cambridge have endowment funds that have led to the destruction of forest lands in Latin America, also in Romania and beyond. Where I work at UT, there's a ban on unionization, so grad students can unionize, which means that grad students and faculty are less empowered and living in a gentrifying city. And I know that there's this work that you've been a part of, Nicola, in terms of fighting Frontex or critiquing Frontex and the role that this university plays. So I think, again, I'm thinking about the undercommons. There's a lot more to be done and to talk about and think about together. So I'm excited too to think about what that means in terms of this ERC project in the lab, like how do we create an undercommons in the lab and think about knowledge production critically and horizontally and through feminist and really housing justice-based lenses, despite the powers of the university and the relationships with the university that we're also in. So I'm excited to see these conversations grow, and I'm excited to be part of them. And so, okay, and turning to the four presentations by Rodrigo, Devra, and Daniela. Amazing. I was struck by how all of them really focus on different dimensions of inhabitation that are often overlooked in studies of housing. And obviously that's what you all are working on together, but we often think about housing as, a place, a physical structure, as a juridical, economic, sort of moral structure, an axis of modern thought, blah, blah, blah. But we're looking at housing as a space of labor, as a space of speculation, of pedagogy, of sex work, of different types of work. And so I really think it's interesting and exciting to track how housing functions through these different lenses and different situations. And I just wrote a couple comments or kind of questions that I'm curious to read more in your presentation. So for Rodrigo, I was really excited to think about how you're thinking about housing and labor coming together in new and exciting ways outside of a sort of Western confine. And I was also excited, I know this is tangential, but you mentioned plants, you mentioned a dog who got evicted. And so, you know, there's a lot of work now on almost like multi-species ethnography. And I think that there's something you could do there, maybe if you wanted to. And so Devra, I was excited to learn about this. I had no idea about this place. And yeah, I was wondering, like, given the long history of broken promises that you outlined, like, why do you think that the speculation of this sort of non-city pervades people's future imaginaries? There have been all these like failed promises, and yet there's a sort of aspiration. And so, like, what other histories, maybe imperial histories, come to bear? I don't know. Also, where does the money come from that's kind of being housed in these unfinished projects? Does the unfinished state of things reflect the pandemic or other crises of capitalism? Just questions. And so for Chiara, yeah, I was thinking, because I think you mentioned early on that you don't have a theory, you just have ethnography, and I was like, well, how can ethnography actually generate theory, and how do we need sometimes ethnography to generate theory? Because I think there's plenty of amazing theory here, and I'm thinking about like how is there a theory in collective housing and squatting being a pedagogical project? And it seems like there is. And how can the very formation of private property be one that we think of as intentionally established to quell collectivity and quell pedagogies that are required to build anti-capitalist features. So yeah, and then for Daniela, yeah, this is also really exciting to learn about what you're working on. I was wondering, how does this type of research require certain types of care when conducting the research itself, and how does care factor in terms of methodology? I was also thinking about some people who study sex work talk about it being a sort of performance, and yet it also seems like trying to obtain housing becomes a performance. You have to kind of perform one thing in order to obtain housing. And there's also the sort of dialectic, right? It seems like how does cycles of housing precarity inform decisions to engage in sex work, and then how does sex work at the same time reproduce context of housing precarity? And so that might be interesting to think about. Yeah, and then also, despite that, it seems like there's still the space of care that pervades. So, okay, I'm going to stop rambling, but those are just the notes that I took, and I'm happy to talk more about it.
I wish I could ramble like you. Thank you very much, Erin. Very, very, very helpful. Ryan.
Thank you everybody. I really enjoyed that and learned a great deal from it. And I really think there's real value in presenting work that's in progress or not fully formed and polished. I think that's one of the best points you can get feedback on. So well done to colleagues making themselves vulnerable and opening up early. I think that's really important. I think collectively this is a really ambitious project, and I remember being on Michele's mock interview panel when he was going for this, and we gave him a really hard time. Gave him a grilling for like 2 hours, and hopefully that was helpful to him. But I remember there was a couple of absences that we pointed to, and I'll say something about those. But I think firstly, I think what this project does is actually collectively looking across these presentations is to really contribute to a really important reorientation towards housing and housing knowledge that is genuinely global and that actually is quite challenging because it demands an unlearning of what is there and out there and what exists and what dominates, as Francesco said. And also those kind of common abstractions, these constant dichotomies in mainstream housing research, and these dominant frameworks you're trying to overcome, because these are things which have blighted housing scholarship for quite some time, and obviously written to an Anglophone dominance as well. So this project embraces, I think, the messiness of housing, its constant segmentation and reconfigurations, and I think that's really, really valuable and important and well done to all. In terms of a few things which I think could come out more, and this is not a criticism of individuals, it's about, I suppose, the wider project, but I think there's much more to be done in kinds of historicizing these relations, I think, and the value of that in terms of capturing this diversity. A bigger mission for me as someone who's not from a traditional academic background was class, and I think class could be a lot more explicit in here, especially kind of the dualized way it works for sex workers and so on. I think there's further elements it could be brought to the fore. And then thirdly, the big one, the environmental considerations here and how that intersects with all these kind of challenges. And then the other one being children and youth. I think there's scope to include children and youth, especially if we're thinking about urban futures and reimagining urban futures. I think there's scope to include more about childhood and youth within there. I think for Mara's presentation, I really like her work on precarity. And I think this is one place where I think history can help us more about what is different. There's always been housing precarity, and I think your work reminds, it's a question to me of what is really different about precarity. I think there's some fruitful lines in historicizing that. And then in Anna's work, I really was struck how the kind of transnationalism or tenant internationalism you were talking about, this trans-border blurring, lack of central organizing, new alliances, reminded me of the other end of the housing system. So those who captured the housing system, and that's what, that was their tactics, I suppose. So how they mirror each other was just an interesting trade-off for me. And I really liked the mention of abandonment. I think that's perhaps another absence, the absence of absence within housing. So the role of abandonment and kind of deindustrialized spaces for rethinking housing. Veda's presentation was really inspiring, I thought. And I think a question there would be, to Veda would be, I'd really like to hear her reflections on the challenge of building that kind of global movement without flattening the differences, as Erin was talking to. Then on Rodrigo, I think this really is opening up new debates, and I think there is perhaps one connection there. I know that there isn't a great deal of literature, but I was thinking of groups at the extremes, at the extreme urban margins, for whom housing and work have always been conjoined and always been integrated. So in the UK context, the groups that I've worked a lot with in the past, gypsies and travellers, there's many groups there that have never separated home and work. So there might be something fruitful there in theorising from that extreme. And then Devra's work really just kind of captured the entrenched contradictions and schizoid nature of planning in India, I think. And I think there's some brilliant work by Sanjeev Rutre, which kind of connects to this, where he argues that these imagined futures that never actually happen are always the visions of planners, and they're not the visions of ordinary folk. And that actually the ordinary folk claim their rights to citizenship through very incremental processes, which are about collectives and about what he calls the right to be counted. Then I saw connections to the work of Tom Goodfellow and Kampala and Kigali, and to Morton Nielsen, where what Morton Nielsen calls spectacular speculation has just changed the frame of housing in Mozambique, and not for the better. And finally, in Daniela's work, it's crazy to think that no one's ever looked at this. It's really, really, that's always a time I think there's some brilliant work where you think, surely we should know more about this. But here, yeah, this is where I thought that kind of double dualized stigma of class and sex work and the histories of that really were uncovering. I think you see a lot of potential here in terms of the power of stigmatization, but also the power of stigmatization to form and to drive new identifications, new collectives and new solidarities. And amazing that you've only just come to this work in the last 18 months. So I've learned a huge amount, and I'm happy to have conversations with anyone after this as well.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Just want to say before passing it on to Margherita that Daniela, Chiara, Devra, and myself, we actually put together a bid to, which we didn't get anyway, but a bid to transform the project into a card game for children. Okay. And to try to play around in habitation. And we still have the project, we may do it, but or we may not do it. It's copyrighted anyway. We need investors, exactly. So this is why you're here today.
Margherita, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me here, first of all, and for the invite. It's extremely exciting to see the progress of the whole project, especially after meeting with many of you recently in Paris and seeing the progress in the fieldwork even from a few weeks ago, or with others we did not have the chance to meet. So it's extremely exciting, and so I'm really grateful to be here. My reflection would mostly be concerned with, let's say, things that we can reflect about together in the face even of collective study, maybe, and having conversations about this. And finding like a connection between all the presentations, I was thinking a lot around the problem of positionality and reflexivity to some extent. Some of you have really directly discussed this matter, especially Mara, Veda, Anna, the people who are, let's say, juggling more the activism and the research side. Other people have not directly touched upon it, but I think this is a crucial point in a project like this, especially if there is a collective goal of thinking about how to find, let's say, a shape for all these different ideas in terms of unsettled, but also unsettling in the sense of in progress propositions and politics. Because what I find extremely challenging and fascinating about this whole project is that many times we have vented in couples or in groups about the mismatch between the timing of academia and the timing of activism, the urgency we feel to raise some issues, to say something, to discuss what's happening as of now. And many, many times we find ourselves on the one hand compelled, of course, to publish, to say something in a project like this. You have work packages, you have deliverables, you have challenging timing. But on the other hand, sometimes we find ourselves in a position where we get stuck in the seemingly never-ending process of revisions that may go on for years, publications that are delayed for 2 or 3 years, and we may end up frustrated in this. We may feel like the conversations we are trying to open is aligned with the urgency and the timing we need, and also the ambition to do what Francesco was pointing towards, to somehow try and, let's say something or contribute also to public debates to some extent. So, of course, we may want to devise new forms of doing this, because it's extremely challenging to bring these in the making processes, ideas, concepts, propositions into the format of academia and into the format of a project like this. And of course, this is more like a concern, an epistemological issue to some extent, but it's also a political one, because many of you in different capacities are active within the context where you are doing research. And this is something that I've confronted myself with. And many, many times I have not found, let's say, a solution to this problem. And I felt this tension between crystallizing something at some point in time to wrap up a paper and make a publication, and at the same time feeling like it's out of time, it's in the moment, it's obsolete when it's published. So this is something that I think we really need to think, we may want to think about collectively. And this is something that regards our role as academics, but again, also as activists in given the different realms where we are militant people.
And so, of course, I don't have many answers about this, but I think this is a big deal that emerged also in the chit chat during the coffee breaks. And so, I don't know, I don't have many solutions to this, just to say, just maybe a small comment / suggestion. I think it would, of course, in a few minutes, it's difficult also to discuss in detail your own positionality and reflexivity within the project you are carrying out, but I think it's critical to also understand where you're coming from, where these research projects and ideas are coming from. So I think it would be very nice to hear about these issues and to reflect about these collectively. So I will not use all the 8 minutes, but just to say that again, I'm really grateful to be here. It was very nice to see how this thing is progressing, and I hope that some of these issues may also be part of a broader conversation that we can mobilize within and beyond this and lab. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Margherita. Can I just ask everybody to give a round of applause to our discussion? Yeah, thank you so much. I won't answer to any of this. I just leave it there. This is extremely helpful. I'm sure also everyone working in the project feels the same. Maybe since it has been a long day, maybe we can take 10-15 minutes for some questions. If you do have questions for researchers, or maybe you would like to give your own discussion. I'm talking about the people online, people in the room. This is a moment maybe where we try to wrap up by providing further ideas or questions. Because I cannot ramble as well as Erin, so I do ramble really in the proper way. Anyone would like to maybe say something at the end of this long day? If at home you have any point, feel free to put it in the chat. So, yeah, maybe not. Yeah, somebody, yes, okay. Okay, so we do have a question. We have a question from the ghost member of the project. Ghost in the sense that we don't see her right now. But Sanchi is the first person, who joined myself here in Turin as a PhD candidate. So now Sanchi is doing impressive work with women street vendors in Mumbai. And indeed, Sanchi, now we see you. Sanchi has a question for Devra. Sanchi, you want to speak the question, tell the question yourself, or should I read it aloud?
I can do that if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can, yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to connect with you online. And I just had a question for Devra. And I mean, this also comes from a personal place because I met Devra when she was in Noida. So I also got like a very close look at the kind of research that she's doing. And I stayed with her at that cursed Airbnb. But yeah, my question was if the Airbnbification of these ghost towers was something that was anticipated by the planners and the dreamers and the architects as like a future form of inhabitation for this global city, or did it then just develop as a more unintended form of inhabitation? So that, yeah, that's all. That was my question. Thank you.
Take the mic.
I'm so glad you said that you came and stayed with me, because I really wanted to say that in the presentation. And saying she was the reason why I left. She came in, I was there for a week, and then she came and stayed with me for a night, and she was like, you have to leave to stay. So if it wasn't, you get like so used to a place so quickly. It's crazy. But thank you, Sanchi, for getting me out of there. And I moved to an inhabited space, thanks to her. I would say that the Airbnbification of these ghost towers was not anticipated or planned. And there's like a very specific distinction in Noida. So you have like the planning of the city is outsourced usually to the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of Delhi. And then you have the city that's controlled by a CEO and a board of directors who are circulating sometimes every 6 months. So the CEO and board of directors might have visions for the city, but the planners are hired to work for like a 5-year term. So there's like a huge disconnect of what's happening in these plans. And the people that I interviewed said that they had like, you know, they anticipated that the global city was going to arrive for people who would be working in the global city. They want these towers filled with upper middle class residents to live in these spaces. But people like my Airbnb host, for example, I think quickly realized that that city was not going to come. And that this like future city is a temporary space of circulation of people coming through the national capital region. And Noida is like cheaper to stay than Delhi, it's cheaper to stay than Gurgaon. So you can circulate through this space. So it was a way for so many of these people to kind of reclaim. They had never like actually bought these spaces ever with this idea of inhabiting it themselves. It was like a speculative investment. But you know, I don't know that for sure. That's like what I would say after a few weeks of being there and some conversations. But thank you so much for being with me, Sanchi. You saved me.
Thank you. Veda, you have a question?
Yeah. Well, just it's like a reaction to the discussions, and yeah, just to come back to Ryan's question of okay, but how can we build internationalism without flattening differences, which is actually a very, very complicated and deep conversation. And but I feel like it is. I feel like we're in a historical time where this internationalist dimension is like taken kind of for granted. You know, there is some sort of sense of like, oh yeah, you know, it's pretty good. You know, it's there is a lot of visibility. There's a lot of voices. There's a lot of like, you know, witnessing and seeing difference. You know, but that is not the space of internationalism. And so one idea is this, that we are taking for granted this dimension. So we need to go back to a more like very basic, radical dimension of this question. And of course, look into the histories, obviously. But I would say that for me, as an organizer, for me, it's when I do this practice of simplifying this vast question, this vast dilemma. So how I simplify is by thinking about, you know, whose voice, whose experience sounds and seems more neutral or seems more applicable. And whose voice and whose experience seems more like sounds like diversity, or sounds like you know, like something that's a bit like quirky, or like a bit, you know. And this kind of like understanding of how unchallenged, you know, untransparent power dynamics go along. I mean, of course, this is actually applicable to other axes of oppression, obviously. But in speaking of this internationalism, this is really, it's actually a practice that we don't really do so much in activist spaces or in political work so much. You know, it's yeah. So there is always a competition, I feel like, between whose political vision seems to be more like close to you know, what history really is, who is defining history, who really understands what's going on. You know, there's like this competition of
who will be able, at the end of the day, to actually have that very perceptive, very clarified, like, understanding of what history is, what's the historical moment, blah, 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 blah. And I feel like in that space, that's where we lose sight of the radical, revolutionary, necessary potential of internationalism. Yeah. Sorry.
That's great. Thank you, Veda. Excellent. Do you have anything else from anyone else? Any kind of final reflection? Roseanne, sure. Always.
Thank you so much. That was so inspiring and amazing to be in this space. Mine have two questions. One, I come from quite a rural area in the UK, and I was wondering how the sort of project conceptualizes like rural spaces and its relationship with the urban, because I feel like this project has a real strength in analysing the connected places and people within particularly urban areas. And yeah, I'd like to hear what people think about, particularly people moving from rural areas to cities, which is such historical precedence in the UK and around the world. So yeah, that kind of social mobility of people to urban areas. I come from a perspective of a youth organiser and see a lot of people moving away and out, and who aren't connected to the histories of the land and people who were there beforehand. So yeah, it'd be interesting to look at like what sort of communities of place, communities of affinity people kind of conceptualising the project. And just building on that strong sense of place, which you also mentioned here, like the situatedness of this project.
Okay, and on rurality, I have my friend here who is sending us a particular framework to
I think it's not everybody's perspective, but I think they gave me this because I've been working in the Amazon for for a long time before this project, and there's the idea that like urbanization is not a process constrained to cities. So you can also see how urbanization takes place outside of their and I do this work on like extractivism and how mining sites, for example, or agribusiness, they entail all new kinds of urban infrastructure in these spaces. But also what I think is interesting now, working with Malik, not on extended urbanization, but the idea of urban extensions, is that we can see how inhabitation is in its own way is a form of extending, urban forms and processes to all different kinds of territories, and how it's like, for example, in the Amazon, this ever-extending motion of workers following large extractivist projects, through inhabitation in itself, they remake all these kinds of elsewhere of urban research that we should also be paying attention. Thank you.
Even mentioned once more. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I'm fully colonized though.
Okay. I don't want to drag this too long. So, anyone else? Any other point? I just would like to wrap this up by thanking three groups of people. First of all, I want to thank my researchers. And again, I am so grateful to work with all of you. It's not easy not easy to work with you. It's not for you easy to work with me, because of things that have been said by some of the discussants, the institutional frameworks of our work. Not necessarily thinking only at the department, obviously, or Italian academia, but it is indeed very complicated to try to navigate the terrains that Erin and Margherita in particular were highlighting before. So this is the struggle for all of us. but I'm glad that we are trying to do it together. In terms of the expectations, I just want to also mention this. I am asking all of them to come up with one key publication out of this project, one key paper. It's one, and that for me it's enough, and it's enough for the ERC. And then to try to work at a book together as a form of collective study, maybe if we're right there, that would be amazing. But I don't aim for this project to be a project where we throw out there 25 papers each. Also because all of them, and you have seen this today, are grounded. And I think, yes, it came up better in the first half, maybe. So from Mara, Anna, and Veda, it's very clear how they are weighed into forms of direct action and struggle. But also, because I know their work intimately, also the researchers in the second half are very much grounded and very much linked up with forms of direct action. And that takes a lot of time, it takes a toll, it takes a whole lot of emotional capacity. So I am actually astonished by what they are achieving. Second, thanks goes to Francesca for being here today. The idea here was to open up this project to the department, and I think it worked very well with all the postdocs and PhDs that were here throughout the day. And I'm very much thankful for you to be here for many reasons that you already highlighted. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for providing these very important points. We took notes, and we're going to reflect on this collectively. And hopefully with some of you continue these conversations within the lab. And yeah, thank you also for the people that followed at home. Now we are heading towards dinner, maybe some drinks. If some of you would like to tag along, you are free to do so. Thank you for staying with us throughout the day, and we'll see each other maybe in a year or in a couple of years to tell you the full story, okay? Thank you.
Bello.
No, bello, thank you for your points. Very, very important. Hey guys at home, thank you so much for being with us. We're going to post the video online very soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye.